All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, we are joined once again by James Tunney, author, painter, mystic, truly a man who I enjoy talking to greatly. This is your fourth time on the show, James. I think you're actually you might hold the record now for most appearances on the Fifth Dimension.
Apart from yourself.
Well, oh
Fantastic.
yeah, that's true. All right, I guess I didn't
Yeah.
count myself in the appearances. Yeah, that would be 200
Yeah,
plus at
that's
this
great.
point.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to continue the conversation and look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to it as well. And, we were talking a little bit. We talked last time we had you on about automaticity, and we dove into it a little bit. We were talking about maybe starting there, and there's a few different themes that we were discussing could be the central idea for this conversation. And I think it's important to map out automaticity and uh, the direction we're moving in. Because, like you said, a lot of this stuff that we're talking about, some of it may sound almost like science fiction in a sense, which is interesting, but it's starting to already creep into our society. We're already beginning to see a lot of the writing on the wall for transhumanism. So, I was hoping you could start with automaticity, where you've been really directing your own focus in this as of late, and what you think is important to shell out in terms of really getting an understanding of it.
Yeah. Well, it's great to see you're writing about transhumanism and those issues, because I think it's very important that we get a range of perspectives. And it's difficult for people to get a grasp of the issues because they seem separate. So what I've been trying to do in the book that I hope to get out shortly is to focus on a particular theme which explains a lot of the issues and explains where the new world order is going and what's going to be new about it. So I mean, anyone that doesn't understand at this time that the idea of a new world order is a real one. I've said that we're living in a new scientocracy, which I call the empire of scientism. This is the new world order. We know that it's been specifically articulated for at least 100 years, going back to Wells and that, and also back to the followers of Nietzsche. Both people know about the connection between Nietzsche and the Nazis. They don't know, for example, about the influence of Nietzsche on Bolshevism. There's a profound connection. There's a book by, I think it was Rosenthal, who made this connection. The only reason we don't know more about it is because they wanted afterwards to purely identify Nietzsche with fascism. But this idea of the new man, the new woman, the new person, the new human, the new myth, it goes back to a lot of those ideas, which are founded on earlier ideas. Right. And so the new world order, we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going to be new about it and how it's going to work? And one of the key ideas that I would put forward is that it's going to be an automatic system, an automatic new world order, that it's going to be based on encapsulating administrative systems, the bureaucracy, in an automatic machine, with the intention that we will be integrated into the machine. This is the real objective, that we become components in the machine. Mm-hmm. So that's one element, that on a macro level, on a system of governance, it's going to be automatic. So you can see this already in relation to, for example, the truckers' dispute in Canada, whereby they can link different things, a push button, and identify you as a dissenter, and then you're excommunicated, because we're talking about a control and communication system. So they're doing in a more sophisticated way what the Catholic Church would have done in the past in medieval Europe. So the system of government is going to be automatic and run by an automatic body, automatic in this sense, not just in the technical sense, but in the way these systems work, how groups come together. Because when people act in a corporate body, that is a unit. People forget that a corporate body, a company, the East India Company, Coca-Cola, they are a unit and they operate as a machine as well. So this is one other level to it, that the systems of regulation are machines. The World Economic Forum is a machine, and it's a machine that operates from the top down, which is another important point. So associated with that macro governance is, how does that relate to us? So we can talk about who, what, when, where, why, but in relation to us, we notice that we probably don't notice, that our lives are becoming more automatic. I mean, in
Mm.
simple terms, for example, the description of a person driving a car on a road, in many senses, it fits into a cyborg, a temporary cyborg definition, because they're encapsulated and they're brought into the machine, which requires a mega machine, which is informed, as Mumford said, by a kind of sacrificial system, which feeds that machine, the war machine, the oil industry, etc., is there to. So we end up serving this. We end up serving this system, and also our lives become more automatic. I remember when I stayed in a hotel in Carolina, and I said I'm going to walk across the road. I couldn't get across the road. There was no, I wasn't familiar with the fact that you couldn't really walk in places. I had to get a taxi across the roads to get over to the other side of it. It was unbelievable. But this idea, oh, well, we have to, we're dependent. And of course, if you are dependent, you don't have a lot of choice. But we're getting made dependent on a whole lot of systems. So as well as that, even those systems, even the automobile, and of course, it's classic automatic system, that's becoming more automatic. So they're taking the drivers out of the loop with driverless cars. So instead of having some, the dream that they sold, supposedly of in the ads, the person driving down the new car, there's no one else around them, the wind blowing through their hair, maybe it's freedom, great American freedom. In reality, as we know now, all cars are recording devices that records everything that you do. And then they're going to take you out of the free choice element, able to identify where you are, what you do, even your things that are happening in your body in these systems. So that's just one example. And of course, our social relationships are mediated by electronic devices. It's good points. People always say, "Oh, what about the good points?" We understand them. There's always good points initially. There was good points when the printing press came about initially, before they applied the censorship system. It's a kind of part of the process. There's always this cycle of growth of technology and then compression and suppression. So in our lives, we're being personally made more automatic. And it's like a process of electromagnetism. The public is magnetized and the individual is magnetized. This is what a lot of this dancing is about. All this nonsense about people dancing, for particular purposes, doing the same action. I can see the kids do it all the time. I saw it during the recent health crisis. So by doing this and by acting automatically, you are showing, you're paying attention, you're worshiping the system, and you're beginning to demonstrate that you are a puppet to the puppet masters that control these systems. You're providing feedback directly of your degree of obeisance to the system. So that automaticity is increasing all the time. So if we look back at Bill Gates, he said in The Road Ahead, written quite a while ago, that we had to get children hooked on computers. Now, I mean, it's a specific word, and they mean it. So they want to get them fed into the system, attached to the system, assimilate, made dependent. And we know also that the technology is going into the body, that they want to put transistors, etc., into the body, so that we are attached to the machine. And as that is happening, not just a kind of analog connection from ourselves to the machine, we are part of the machine. And when we're made part of the machine, then our free will, whether you call it God-given or divine consciousness, whatever, is gone. And it's not just gone in a personal level, or where we represent the ancestors who've gone before us. This is something which is, if you believe in certain spiritual traditions, is eternal in its consequence, potentially. It's something that we are agreeing to do. So there's a macro level of automaticity. There's a personal level of automaticity where we're being made automatic and becoming automatons, which works on the inherent physical automaticity that we have already. I mean, we don't instruct our body to heal a wound, for example. It automatically, that's a biological automaticity. We know that. but intends to be a mechanical automaticity. And the last point in the triangle, so general, specific, and then we have the extrapolation from humans into mechanical beings, androids, whatever, where we have a separate robotic system which seeks to create a simulacrum of the human. So the human that's been made automatic becomes closer and closer to the machine that's been made human. So this is all part of a system to control us into the network. So the classic automaticity can be a good thing. For example, when you're meditating, the cognitive executive function in your brain goes to sleep, if you like, and that's what opens you up to higher experience. But that's contrast to opening yourself up to control by a mechanical system. So that's the broad brush way, and within that, there's a lot of themes about where these things come from: robots, sex dolls, the whole lot. They've come from different elements.
Right. Yeah. And you can see just looking at our own daily actions and observations of our lives, how we are already sort of playing into this automaticity concept and really, I would say, fracturing our lives to meet the demands of this system in a lot of ways, right? I mean, how much free will do we truly have when most of our sovereignty is actually to survive within this system, right? And if we look at the direction that it's moving, it's very clear, the architects of mankind are the ones who want to be the architects are the World Economic Forums. They're the people in governments who are working for this agenda. And they have talked about how man is going to have technology implanted into them by the year 2030, right? They say smartphone technology. We're not going to be holding it in 10 years. It's going to be inside of us. And you can make the case that there's nanotechnologies already present, and a lot of us are unconsciously aware of it. So it seems very evident that this is something that's fast approaching. And because it's been rolled out so slowly, I mean, we're just now getting to the self-driving cars, and we're just sort of what we imagined in those sci-fi movies 25, 30 years ago, where in the iRobot, where you got the robots walking down the street and things of that nature, right? That's sort of your typical sci-fi, I would say, portrait of sort of a transhumanist uh, picture. But at the same time, we have to have these implementation steps slowly but surely, because if they just tried to roll out implanting a chip into your arm 20 years ago without any sort of build up and lead up, people aren't going to actually go along with that. They're not going to see how the potential, the what they would call the benefits of it, or how it makes sense in the next line of progression, right? Sort of this like self-guided evolution process these people are really putting onto us. They're trying to direct the future of mankind. So I think it's important to really look into exactly what these people, the people who are driving the society, what they actually want, what is their intention. And when you get into that, I mean, you can very easily see the direction that we're moving in. Like what is the purpose for mankind truly to be linked to I guess in automaton and become this sort of worker bee in the system? Well, it creates a system of efficiency, not for the individual soul or individual expression, but for the efficiency of this system that is being created, right? And there can't be individual expression within that. There can only be conformity. There can only be the one sole purpose instead of having a multitude of individual purposes and individual meanings and individual expressions, right? So it seems very clear that that is I would say, purpose behind transhumanism, at least, and maybe you could dive a little deeper into that. But I think people really need to sit with what it is that they want on an individual level and how they view their own soul and their own um, individual expression versus the nature of the external reality that we're living in. And if our own value system is in alignment with that of this transhumanist agenda.
Yeah, well, they're not going to have a lot of choice about it, frankly. So
That's true.
the ultimate objective is to turn humans into a form of energy. I mean, that's it'll take a long time to explain that, but that's really what it is. By fitting you into the system, this is the objective. And I mean, if you could analyze, for example, some of the worst aspects of the Industrial Revolution or slavery, in terms of translating humans into energy,
Right.
into work. That's what the objective of a lot of these systems are. And that's important to bear in mind that if you look at the technocracy movement in the United States, it's based on energy. Everything is about energy. If you look at the technotronics movement associated with Brzezinski, it's about energy systems. So energy is important. So the energy replaces the economy, and this is why you have all this green idea and all that. It's bringing everyone. And so when you're told it's great that now the techno structure can solve these environmental problems, it's bringing you into the technosphere, which ultimately will displace nature, all of nature, not just humans. And this was anticipated by people like Lilly and that. But really, when I say about the 1920s in the modern form, we're at the end of this. Is the final phase where we're just actually facing the checkmate situation. I mean, I think whatever way we want to look at it, we're maybe one move or the forces are aligned against us. So really, it goes back. I've traced it in particular to the growth of the modern imperial system, which I'd associate in particular with the Norman genius for organization and administration, going back to the early Plantagenets and that. And it gives us some idea. And growing up through the various places, the Angevin Empire, the after Norman conquest, in Britain, the United Kingdom, and France, and the relationship between them. I mean, that's where a lot of the battles have been fought in, the amazing amount of battles fought in France, etc. And from there, they and utilizing lessons from the church, etc. The growth of the common law system came, and the growth of power structures. But if we remember that the Normans came over in 1066, and the power structure, the feudal pyramid, is still there. So whatever way you look at it, the power structure is still in place. So with a pyramid, so people try and say, oh yeah, other people are saying, you're not about me, but that you're talking about Jews or some group. No, I'm talking about the British Empire and other imperial structures, and in particular royal families and the whole structure of power. It's not just about them. And in fact, they often play a minor role in it. If you look at the royal families, although they have a role in it across Europe, what were they interested in? They were interested in the breeding of people in the system, the families. They were interested in things like breeding horses, breeding dogs, breeding plants. This was crucial. If you look at a lot of the voyages of exploration, they were to get plants to bring home and breed them. I think it was the Crusaders brought back carnations. What did Columbus go to India for? He's looking for spices. What did the Dutch do in their empire? They went and they got plants and they brought them back. What was one of the biggest early financial crises? The tulips bubble in Dutch history. So we get a system of administration, of bureaucracy to manage empire, to manage control. And at the center of all of it is military superiority. So for the last 1,000 years, the world has been run by people who believe that might is right. And they've been very good at blaming, for example, the Catholic Church. And these were commandeered as well at some stages and were used. And I'm not trying to under or downplay their role in these things, but really it's the people that have military power that are deciding things. Now, this system has continued. So by the time we get to the First World War, that same apparatus is there. Second World War, and in particular in the Second World War in places like Bletchley Park, the Anglosphere, the remains of the British Empire, began to reinterpret itself. So they're very good, obviously, in espionage, intelligence, electronic signals. And out of there came the cooperation between Britain and the United States. Now, there's another question about whether the United States was ever independent. Is another question we could look at. But Churchill and I had the idea that the Anglosphere would need to anticipate the range of problems that existed. And I mean, people might say, well, you're overestimating the role of Britain. Of course, we have to put in the previous German empires and the French and the Spanish, the Portuguese. But the British have a genius for this type of thing, and they have a genius for establishing rules. So if you think about when you're flying or when you're engaged in a whole lot of activities, the international language is English. A lot of these are English. The Anglosphere, the Atlantis, this thing that Chomsky talks about, it's no mere accident. And here's an example of automaticity. I don't know if you ever played golf, but so you're out there hitting a ball or out with your pals, hitting the ball around. Now, there's slightly separate bases of the rules in America, but they're all basically the same rules around the world. So as we're speaking, there are millions of people, probably, some people out on their own, just going around the course, and they're playing in accordance with a system of rules that goes back to the fact that a group of lawyers in St. Andrews sat down and established uniform groups of rules. Okay, so the people are out there. So they're out there and they could do anything else. They could do whatever they want with the ball. They could play snooker. They could kick it, whatever. No, but they have automatically taken in the rule for good purposes for the game. And they're hitting and saying, no, I can't do this. There's 2 shots. I dropped the shot. I have to do this. And that goes back to the establishment of rules. So the British Empire was brilliant at establishing rules, not just golf. If you look at whether yachting, soccer, rugby, it's quite amazing. It's the genius of rules. What is a rule? A rule is the basis of regulation. It comes from a ruler. He or she who rules creates the rules. Now, it applies in a whole range of contexts. And then the system of empire and the idea of breeding, and you referred to eugenics in your article. Eugenics is a double-edged sword. One of the reasons why they were interested in eugenics was because most of the royal family were physically degenerate. Because of inbreeding. If you look at the pictures, the Habsburgs they all had blood problems, for example, a lot of the royal families. So the Habsburgs had problems associated with too small of a pool of breeding. If you look at some of the pictures of the other royal families, you can see there's something a bit odd in some context. And that was one of the reasons why the eugenics movement, they were interested in that. Could it improve them? And this is the real objective of transhumanism at the top. It can improve my life, improve my being. We can defy the natural order. And at the other end, all these systems going back to the Roman Empire, and a lot of it does go back to the Roman Empire. When William the Conqueror came to Britain, he left alone the city of London. Sorry, mentioning that chops a bit off your viewing figures according to the algorithm.
Well, that's fine.
But he left the city of London alone. The city of London is the longest, the longest, most persistent system of governance in the world. And it's still there, still governing the financial system. It was the one behind most of the plantations. It was behind the plantations in the United States. The original plantations, the Virginia Company and these ones, of which the other plantations are an iteration. So the power systems are there, and they're all dependent on a material view, on control, and the breeding element comes in as one factor. So by the time we get to Darwin, we have this idea of moving from, evolution is the explanation. Cut out God out of the equation, and we'll just go full force into the artificial evolution. artificial selection. So the ruling class can control that. So what happened with the empire, the British Empire never went away. It transmuted into what I call the empire of scientism, which allows other ones fit in. The Chinese Communist Party can fit in because they can agree on this technocratic basis. Whether the United States was ever really, in a way, independent from these financial structures is another issue, but certainly Australia and New Zealand wasn't. And if you look at how the recent crisis, how that played out in places like New Zealand, Canada, Australia, they're all former British Empire, Anglo-sphere thing, and it never really went away. Ireland, for that matter. So what we have is the growth of a bureaucracy which never went away. The idea that there was going to be people in control, and they have a superior right to control, and they had a connection with the divine because they always used the divine right of kings. Now they have the capacity, not the royal families, but the people at the top, the technocrats, the elites, and joining with the new royalty, the wealthy, the billionaires, the tech giants. They have the capacity to transmute themselves. They believe they're gods. So that's why people like Yuval Noah Harari is talking about, no, we are the gods now. There's no such thing as spirit. So it's a long-term movement which goes back to a denial of a superior force, a God is dead argument, which comes throughout the whole thing, a belief in it's not really science, it's the use of science and technology, particularly as developed in the military industrial complex, to control population. And the last point, sorry for going on so long, in the United States, where it manifests was that the military industrial complex began to develop systems that were applied throughout society. So most education technology, for example, comes from the military. We have DARPA, and we have the growth of the internet and the World Wide Web at CERN, a connection of scientists. So what we have is the movement of the military industrial complex, which was at the base of all these imperial powers, into shadow government and into the precursors of global governments. Because I promise this is the last point. A significant
I was going to
factor,
say, you can keep going.
a significant factor that has to be in relation to the historical origin is the 1860s. And what happened, which is quite interesting, was we had the growth of the postal service, and people like Charles Babbage, who designed the first really modern computer, he contributed towards that in the penny post system. He had designed his computer to help with boring administrative solutions, because when you set up an apparatus, then you need a system to manage that apparatus. It becomes too difficult for a smaller group. So you need a technology which helps you manage. And this is what they understood going back to the Doomsday Book, 1086, get all the information, all the data, and then you can control people. You can tell that Evan McDermott has 2 cows and 3 sheep. That was the detail they knew, 1,000 years ago. Imagine the detail they know now. It's unbelievable. But information is important in this. So postal service is one of the systems that grew up and nobody objected to it. You can post, that's great. Nobody said, well, who's making these rules? They didn't object to it. And associated with that was the growth of the international, what became the International Telecommunications Union in the 1865. So this was the start of organizing a global apparatus, a global web, really. It started then. So it's not 1960. We have to go back to 1860. So the international telecommunications linking up, cable under the Atlantic. People don't know a lot of the story about that. And that's the basis on which all satellite communications. And if you look at key players in this movement, for example, like Arthur C. Clarke, what's he interested? He claims to have conceived the communication satellite, and he understood the implications. He believed that we would merge with machine. He believed it would happen because that's what they wanted to happen. So communications becomes critical. All this stuff, it's not for our advantage. All these networks are control mechanisms. All these, and there's even interesting elements. Now, I'm not saying I'm totally convinced by this, but if you look at a book like The Invisible Rainbow, that
Yeah.
claims, for example, that there was no such thing as anxiety disorders before the 1860s, that as this technology comes, they each have profound effects on individuals and their mental state because there's electromagnetic waves, and that influences us. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. They were involved in all these electromagnetic system control things. So there's a number of different dimensions, but they do go back. It's not recent. Looking at the recent manifestations fails to understand the complexity of the situation beforehand, and how international systems of finance, international systems of regulation, international bodies are modern manifestations of movements that happened and grew up over a long period of time, of which most people have never paid any attention to. And maybe they don't have to pay attention to, because their ability to pay attention is going to be taken away. Sorry for going on so long.
No, definitely. I mean, there's so much to what you just said, but I think, what you're speaking to is the fact that, we can look at things like, 5G technology, for example, right? And there's another word that's going to trigger the sensors. But you can look at that and you can see pretty clearly that it does have an impact on human beings, right? I mean, I think we are electromagnetic beings. So the very introduction of things like electricity, of the telecommunications industry, people don't realize that it did change us from that moment on. And, that's 150 plus, and more than that at this point, 170 years ago. So realistically, we have to dig back over 170 plus years just to get to the root of where this emerged. But then again, it goes back even further based on what we were talking about in terms of the imperialistic nature. So realistically, to understand why all of this is actually taking place, I mean, it's not as simple as these people want to have control over us. Like, yeah, that's it. Like, they do. They're creating a system of where humans are used as energy, like you said, but it doesn't necessarily address the root. And I mean, anybody who's pulled weeds out of the garden knows that you need to pull out the roots or they're going to grow right back, right? So I don't think it's any perceived solutions necessarily. Like, they're not going to come in a legislative sense. They're not going to come from within the confines of a system that was specifically designed to meet this end goal of the man merging with machine, right? So we really
and
need
women.
and yeah, exactly. Well, we got to be inclusive, men, women, and anybody else who's out there nowadays. I don't know, but it's there. So I think we really need to almost step outside the box and really get you thinking about it. Like, if we want to combat this, and you might be right in the sense that we're one move away from checkmate, and there's not much we can do about it, but to really uncover the roots, I think, is important to actually understand what it means to have, like you were saying, an automatic new world order, right? Because you can very clearly see how the automaticity has crept up over the last 150, 170, 200 years, however long it's been. And even just in our own lives, I mean, I was born in 1995. So I was born into a system that was already incredibly automatic in its nature. So I like, our very programming is to be automatic. And I almost wonder if that is human. Like, you have to wonder, is that even human nature to live in such an automatic, structured way? And part of me says we need, like, I like, maybe we need a sense of routine and purpose and meaning, and that can come from our daily structure. But at the same point, there's such um, a truth to living in a sense of spontaneity and innocence and more a wild nature, right? So there's been a true inversion just the root of who we are with all of these structures, which makes it very difficult to combat.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you said, going back a bit further, I mean, just to add to that, of course, one of the important eras was around the turn of the 1800s. And in particular, the growing understanding about electricity. And in particular, the work of Galvani and his nephew Aldini. Now, Aldini was the nephew of Galvani, who did the experiment with the frogs that showed, with a dead frog, you could make them move by putting current, whatever, through the body. And then they did the same. His nephew in London with he could make a criminal corpse, move. And now they couldn't. It was difficult for him to do it in Italy because at that stage they didn't kill them in the same way. But in London, they were still hanging them just on Newgate. And Newgate, of course, Newgate prison. It was a prison, one of the many prisons on the edge of the city of London. But so whether she went to see them or not, this was where Mary Shelley probably got the idea for Frankenstein. So the idea of reanimating and animating. So, but here is an important idea. So what these guys began to think was, so there's no God. Everything is physical force, and I can demonstrate that. I can resurrect the body. And then people began to look at in a deeper sense. So when we go to the 19th century and we have Maxwell, and of course Maxwell wrote his paper on governors about circuits and electromagnetism, electricity and magnetism. On governors, that's the key paper. So notice governance is a key idea. And that you can send a current one way and send another way, creating a circuit. And this model is actually one step away from the model of how they magnetize the public now. Pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-Trump, send the current, whatever. There were ideas of developing a governance machine that go back to the 1700s. So the people that believed that humans were machines also believed, therefore, that the logical thing to do would be to control society by a machine. And this is what the automaticity, the automatic New World Order is, to have auto-governance. So you put it all into a machine. And I'm hearing from people around the world that begin to understand this because they're encountering this. So this takes out human element, human discretion. You can have an objective. Evan McDermott, bad, radical. I'm not saying, but if you classify, give a dog a bad name, push button, all the things join up, bing, 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 and you're excommunicated, or worse. If you're in the machine, if you're part of the machine and physically dependent on it, you're terminated. And this is an important word because you're becoming aterminal. Whereas we're meant to be spiritual receivers, we're becoming mechanical receivers. And being a terminal as well, we can also be terminated. They can just bypass us from the thing. So we're being made so dependent on these systems that we can be alienated. So Frankenstein was important in this idea of the automaton, of humans creating machines that were human-like. And this is an old idea. It goes back to ancient times. Hero of Alexandria, he used to make automatic birds, and this idea of creating an automatic human has been around for hundreds of years. It became very important in the 1700s, where there was a fad for creating automatic, beings that look kind of like the people these days on the videos. And that was giving a sense of power over life. It seems to be a magical power to the ruling class. So in a lot of the royal houses, they would have automatic figures. And another people that had these as patrons, a role in this was the Catholic Church, actually, because you used to go into churches and there were angels that would mechanically come down and saints that would do things until the church began to say, no, this is not really the thing that we should be doing. But the royal families continued with this idea. So that idea of creating artificial life is a fundamental aspect of the idea that it's not God that creates life. And even if we go back to a lot of creation stories are about creating life by infusing clay with life, as if the life and spirit is something different. So to distinguish between the elements of us, the spiritual element and the physical being that we are incarnated in. So even the idea of incarnation is that there's a force that comes in or within us as opposed to being emergent. So the and what you said there about the being integrated into the key idea that I'd like to explain is about the loop. This is that key idea to help people understand about what's going on and about how we're looped into the equation.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me because I look at something like Tesla's technology, right? And that sort of, he had the wherewithal to understand that we are EMF beings, right? But there is a natural energy source that is actually available to us and can be used to create an unlimited energy supply for us and can be used by us so that because I think he understood, and why he was suppressed is because he recognized that our system, in a sense, you can't create energy from material finite structures, from this sort of man-made artificial reality, right? It's a never-ending game of continual expansion and imperialism. But if we I guess if you put humans into this loop that you described, and we become the batteries, and it's like you continually replace the batteries in the TV remote, like, yeah, it'll keep working. Like, don't worry about it. This is the same thing with us in this system, right? And you take away our actual ability to have any free will within it, to have any uh, sovereignty to where we're putting our energy. That system is just going to continue in a loop fashion, like you were just sort of hinted to, right? It's sort of an inescapable. The more I think about it, it feels inescapable in its nature because you get so dependent within it that there's no ability to actually perceive anything outside of it, right? I mean, it's what Rudolf Steiner talked about in terms of escape the vaccines, for example, another word that's going to get this podcast. We got three trigger words now. We're
Oh,
really
I'm giving up now. There'll be no views.
well, I guess that's fine. We'll deal with it. But the vaccine that disconnect the spirit from the I don't remember the exact terms that he used for it.
Yes,
but
yeah.
disconnecting the spirit, and so we're so stuck within the material body and the material form, and that there isn't actually even the ability to perceive another form of consciousness and the spirit, right? And so there you have through the creation of this artificial life, you're actually inverting life itself and really creating a system of death by all facets of it. That's to me what it feels like, this this attempt at an extension of life. And I have to wonder what the controllers of this system, um, their own, if the personal motives of this. I mean, they are aware of what they are doing to life and to the planet and to, um, I would say, themselves in a way, but it doesn't seem to be stopping them from uh, going and creating this, right? So,
Oh yeah,
uh,
there's no question about that. Yeah, I mean, sorry.
I was going to say, I have to wonder if they themselves have an inverted sense of their own um, consciousness, and they don't have that connection to spirit. That's certainly what it seems. And maybe this is just their material solution. It's like, yeah, I'm going to be immortal. We're going to create this system and we're going to be all efficient. We're all going to be happy. And maybe they truly believe it. And I think there are people who advocate for these policies and these technologies who buy into that. But at the very top, I mean, I have to think that they know what they're doing. So, I don't know what do you think is that fine line in terms of, uh, I guess, finding ourselves within that loop, and these people who are creating that, what do you think is their intention behind that? Are they consciously aware? And if they are consciously aware, to me, if anything, it would be better for us if they're not consciously aware of what they're doing, because maybe they could have that awakening of, oh, wait a minute, let's put the pause here. But at the
Mm.
same time, it's, I look at somebody like Elon Musk, and he's perceived by many as for freedom, but at the same time, he creates the self-driving cars, and he creates the satellites that create the smart grid, right? So you have all of these different people who play into it, I think, in subtle ways, and people don't even recognize.
Well, just on the last point, for example, um, I I bet on Trump to win the election. I
Mhm.
put I don't gamble, but I I was convinced that he was going to win, and I said, well, actually, my wife said, well, if you do believe that, should do it, and I did, and it was very so, and I couldn't understand the madness afterwards. But one, even on that point, I was surprised when he said that he was going to bring in the military to administer the vaccine.
Yeah.
That his supporters, that was the thing that I couldn't understand. That was the thing I couldn't understand. And I have written articles about that in many senses. None of these people are beyond the system. None of these people. The idea that national sovereignty exists, even in the United States, you're just kidding yourself. So no matter who is put in there, it's not. And that's why we can't leave it over. We can't hope for things like that. And associated with that is the idea, the imperative for spiritual evolution. But just let me explain this loop a bit more.
Mhm.
If you look at Tolkien, was of course very spiritual, part of the Christian sense, with C.S. Lewis, who wrote about Scientocracy, who understood what was happening. He wrote a book, That Hideous Strength, in the 40s, which explained how the universities, in his story, a fairy tale for adults, he has the universities being taken over, that university being taken over by the progressives for scientific purposes. So a lot of this, a lot of people don't understand. Both left and right are in favor of this mechanism, and it's amazing how many people on the left have allied to this progressive neoliberalism. So you're not going to get it from the political system as it stands. And the other people on the right, I used to talk to some American friends, and I believed that they had studied very much the literature which underpinned market freedom and liberty, because they were always citing J.S. Mill, for example, Hobbes, and they'd give off a litany, and I say, oh, okay, they must have studied this, and they have a theory. And then I began to understand over a period of time that I had no idea who these guys were, and some of them didn't, and they were rehearsing an argument without looking further. Because if you look at all these people, another person they usually talk about in the context of Prometheanism is Milton, Mill, Hobbes. All these people were associated with the empire. In fact, most of them worked with companies associated with plantation. They were heavily involved in the imperial structure, and we're supposed to take these people, often a lot of them that had connections with the war machine, slavery, as the people who are guaranteeing our liberty. They never intended it to be liberty for everybody. It's a kind of myth. So even on the right as well, I wouldn't let them off. The idea, oh, we're only concerned with freedom. They generally, if you look at what they're talking about, the people they cite are from the same system. It's
Right.
a different imperial system. So we're not going to get a lot of hope from there. But if we go back to the Lord of the Rings, and I think it was his son said, well, the ring referred to technology, and of course the ring refers to a loop, towards a power loop, a structure. So we see that these things are happening from the top. For example, the World Economic Forum, which meets in the same place where Thomas Mann wrote The Magic Mountain, and that's based there, and that has again discussions of the same issues about control. So what we get is this top down where they form a ring, a connection of people. Now, you're not allowed to do that in national, under UK or US law. Companies are not allowed to join together because it's against the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act. It's illegal because they understood with Standard Oil, the railroad companies, that if they come together, then they didn't have to compete. They could set the prices, set production, limit production, do the things that you talked about in relation to Tesla. You could deny what was there. You could stop new technology coming in. You just agree on it. And you have this, so there you have the loop, the ring. Now that ring can then form rings below it because they have this fund from the excess they've taken from the market that they wouldn't get from a competitive market. So they can use that spoils to begin to pay off people below them, to the scientists, get them to do their bidding, people below, and a whole range of useless idiots who are just focused on the particular topics. And into that, we have the left brain, right brain distinction that Ian McGilchrist talks about, the matter of things, etc. There are certain people that can only see the world, they're blind to other things. The left brain is blind to issues it doesn't understand. And if you're heavily disposed towards that left brain, technocratic, manipulative kind of way, you could believe that you're doing good because you can't see beyond that. And this is the type of mentality that is dragged into the military industrial complex, because they're the people that you want to think through systems in a kind of autistic way. No offense to autistic context, that's the term they've used in techno-autism, and people like Taleb have used. A certain type of mentality that is utilized to feed into that context. Highly intelligent people, highly able to engage in complex systems. So that type of mindset, left brain mindset, is brought in, and they are manipulated by people above them who fit into a bureaucracy. And if we look at people like Adolf Eichmann, for example, he's a classic administrator who saw the Holocaust and the administration of the Holocaust as a medical problem. Interestingly, that was the description, and used it as his defense in Jerusalem, dealing with a medical problem. And that's the term that when we talk then about useful idiots, we're talking about what the Leninists describe: people who believe they're doing good, but are really being manipulated by their puppet masters in a system to achieve the results. So then we have, unfortunately today, a lot of that is young people, that at the bottom who have been excluded and are told certain things, and they go out and do it. So even in groups like, say, for example, Black Lives Matter, there's another thing, another few points. But Black Lives Matter, it's very selective in relation to the type of Black lives that do matter. For example, I've been looking at the reporting of the massacres in Nigeria, or the non-reporting of it. Like it was report on Pentecost Sunday, the Reuters, but they didn't report on Monday, I think, reported about the massacre of 50 people attending mass, men, women, and children. It didn't make any news internationally. And then they began to, the reports afterwards saying, well, some kind of disturbance, murders in Nigeria. They don't know who did it. They did know who did it, but it doesn't fit the agenda. So there's been hundreds of Christians, for example, killed in Nigeria, but that doesn't matter because they're Christians. And Christians are people that, if they're doing the proper thing or the part of, they might be a group which opposes some of these things. And if we go back to H.G. Wells said we have to abolish, and this is where it comes from. It's not necessarily this scientific view or anticipated a lot of the Marxist or Nazi views. They wanted to destroy the family, destroy religion, and destroy loyalty to the nation state. And they've done that remarkably well. They've done that remarkably. So people can be useful idiots to satisfy that, oh, it's for this other reason that we're doing that. And they begin to repeat things. I don't have a television, but I realized that about 20 years ago, I didn't need it. So because certain people would repeat what the messages are on the television, I didn't have to watch the news, because if you wanted a view on anything, you'd say to a certain person, what's the oh, this is what is happening, you know, and they tell you, and intelligent people too. So it surprised me. So the loop refers to a power loop, and the power loop creates loops below it, and that's where they, as they did in the Catholic Church, according to Malachi Martin, these bodies begin to establish key players below them. So you position agents of change in organizations. So you can take over organizations to implement a certain view. You can use organizations to achieve objectives that are totally inconsistent with the purposes on which they are founded. Mm. So you can turn religious organizations into political tools, for example. Now, you see this in Trotskyism, for example, but it predated that. It goes back to the scientists in the 1860s, like Thomas Huxley, and he set up the X Club in Britain to penetrate the organizations and to take spirit out of their discussions. So they couldn't do dispirited discourse, and that was in the 1860s. So the loop then comes down to what they're establishing is a power loop. The global governance system is a power loop, which will be controlled by the controllers. This is what cybernetics is about. Cybernetics is about governance. So you're then brought into this loop through a series of loops to establish it into this great big governance system where there's no such thing as money or communication or anything else beyond this integrating or interacting with the loop. And part of this before, at the earlier stage, they used this philosophy of the loop in relation to indoctrination. So you begin to implant messages into people until they begin to reflect them back. This is the loop. It's a penetration of the mind. It's the symbol of the metaverse and of a number of companies, this 8 figure. The 8 figure is the link between the outside circle and the inner circle inside you, and they're controlling it. They're going to penetrate into your consciousness, to integrate your consciousness. So there's a loop formed. Even in music, it's quite interesting that in the 60s, the Amen loop, as it's called, the 7-second section, is the basis of most of rap music. It's 7 seconds from one song is the basis of an incredible amount of music. It's just repeating the thing again and again and again and again. And even to describe the propaganda model, what happens is, I have a message. The message is you want to take whatever the things, we won't mention again, but we want you to take that. So we have a loop that goes into your brain through this communication process. So like in a computer, you have loops. So you send the same message again and again until it gets in different forms, until it gets across. It just keeps going on and on and on and on. It's a mechanical, automatic system. So we don't have to have loads of people. We have to have key players, influencers in the loop, and then the machine automatically does it. So that's why our news is the same, or if you turn on 40 different news channels, they're all saying the same thing, because the power loop controls the propaganda model that goes back, as we know. Bernays described that in the 20s, that there was an invisible government that ruled your taste and you didn't even know it, as Chomsky has talked about. So the media is part of this loop. It's a sub loop. It's a loop that operates on your cognition and whatever like that. The political system is a loop. So you go along and say, here I am. You're not getting into it. You're not in the loop. Whether you're in the particular loops is decided by gatekeepers along the way. Who is this guy? No, he's not. We don't want him. And then they put in people that make the loop. So all these sub loops begin to contribute towards the purposes of the higher loop, the higher ring, which begins to set up a technological system to do the job, and will eventually cut out all those bureaucratic idiots that they have brought in, the managers, the experts. They will be cut out of it eventually, because they'll be surplus to requirements of the machines as well. So I think it's important for people to think of that. The opposite of the loop is the mystical loop, the idea that you're developing a connection in your body, your body, your heart, your mind, and then this loop establishes connection with divine consciousness. This is the whole basis, and it's there in the mystical poets, the metaphysical poets that describe the circle of light, for example. Now, what these people are trying to do is to substitute that mystical consciousness, spiritual consciousness, with a mechanical consciousness, so they control it. And when they do that, then all the ideas, fears, realities, archetypes of the devil, Ahriman, all these figures gain power. And that's what Steiner was talking about. So this is the system of establishing, if you like, a hell. And a lot of the demons, if you look at the medieval pictures, they're servants. They're doing the task with their, the technological punishment. So ultimately, turn us into energy, but it will be energy of a demonic sort, because this is the thing that's behind. And last point, do they believe in it? Well, you'd have to take seriously some of the deeper beliefs in say, Satanism as an inversion of what's there, because people have been sold an idea that Satanism is just that kind of California stuff. It's nice, it's kind of countercultural, into a bit of music and all that kind of stuff. But that's not consistent with what deeper, that people have written about it referred to. And again, it's associated with this idea of Prometheanism, of supreme power reside in the individual, of the magician, the black magician, who's exerting power, who's exerting will, who's exerting their will on the world. The triumph of will is, and do what they wilt. So it forces us to look at who they are and who we are. And the bigger problem, we don't have control over them. So we do have control over ourselves, and we're the ones that are acquiescent in it, and we're the ones that will pay for it. We're going to pay for it. Society is going to pay already for what their negligence, our negligence. We haven't got the bill yet for that. That's coming. But on the positive side, it really forces us to look at our own power, and our own power. If this is what they're afraid of, us understanding that it's always been an attack on our power. If we activate our power, if we actualize, we apply it and use it and realize our spiritual consciousness, and begin to, by example, communicate that to others, and be in the context of a robust analysis of what's happening, we'll be able to do something.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of, when I sent you that video on Zen, and I was thinking of automaticity, what you just described, it reminds me of the fact that, and it makes me think of, for myself, a lot of these concepts, a lot of these ideas that they're pushing forward, it is just the ultimate inversion of our own natural state, our natural Zen that is available, the spiritual consciousness. And they're able to really sell it to us because it's still at a subconscious level almost meets our need to exit the mind, to not live confined to I guess a lot of the ideas or entrapments that we're so used to being caught up within, right? I mean, automaticity, you're kind of creating a mindlessness, which is, I mean, I guess is different than mindfulness, but
it's in the same domain. You're right, yeah.
But I think that's really why you're able to get people to not even look outside of their current structure or their current framework, because some of these inverted truths are still checking their quote unquote spiritual boxes, if you will, right? That's, I think that's the ultimate, the evil genius of this system, is they figured out a way to really hijack and manipulate that consciousness. So maybe they're not even necessarily eliminating it, but they're using it in such a way that it is inaccessible in a more pure and radiant and really beautiful form that it actually is when you express it, the spiritual consciousness in its highest truth, and when you start to understand who you are. So that to me makes me think that I would say this plan, this push for transhumanism, I mean, ultimately spirit can never truly be killed, but it can be hijacked. When I was talking to Paul Chek and I brought up transhumanism, and he said, well, the idea of putting your soul on a hard drive. They clearly don't understand the nature of a soul, right? And I kind of agree with him in that sense, because I don't believe you can, regardless of any system, I don't believe you can encapsulate the soul, which is the pillar of who we are. Like we can't recreate that no matter how hard we try. And when we die, well, we'll die and we'll look back at this life and be like, wow, we really got duped, didn't we? We really got tricked. And so I don't, I, I almost think that this immortality push, it's not something that is truly realistic, I guess, in its nature. In a way, I think it creates the ultimate circumstance of Earth being an inescapable hell, but at the same time, once you die, if anything, maybe that would be a relief from this system, because I don't know, that sounds a little morbid, but I think you understand the point I'm making in that sense. So uh, to me, I almost feel a little bit optimistic and hopeful in the sense that they can't actually, I don't believe they can kill spirit, or they can actually take away the true spiritual consciousness once you have actually tapped into that, and once you are locked into it and you know it in your heart, right? I mean, you can have all of these outside forces continuing to try and, you know, push ideas, push agendas onto you, but when you're locked in with who you are, you're not going to fall victim to that trap. I guess it's a matter of getting enough people to take that first step out of the trap now, because I mean, there's plenty of people who see through it. I mean, there's plenty of people who are aware of what's going on, but there's still enough people that are powering the engine of this machine so that it still has really a death grip on mankind, and a death grip on our future. And there isn't going to be a future. There isn't going to be a true, I would say, individual self as we know it in this sort of new world that they're looking to create. So, um, I don't know, because if anything, it feels like our world is kind of splitting right now, in a sense, where you have the people who are interested in spiritual consciousness choosing one path, and you have those falling for the transhuman agenda going down the other path. And so I wonder what that's going to look like. I don't know if the spiritual consciousness path can necessarily organize itself with the power that this machine has, right? And you don't even necessarily want that power, but to be able to create a life that is sustainable and happy and free and built on the pillars of love and truth. Uh, I don't know if I don't believe these two realities can actually coexist at the same time. Like, a lot of people are talking about building parallel structures and building parallel societies, which
Mm.
I like the idea of it. I think we do need to lay the groundwork for things that we would want to organize ourselves by. But at the same time, I don't believe and maybe it's just a belief. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. It's hard for me to imagine that this system of control, this machine, allows for there to be a coexistence between itself and other parallel structures.
Yeah, you're right. I agree with you on that. There's a few points that came up as you're talking about this. I agree with Paul Check on most of these things. However, just to fine tune a little bit of it, if you believe that we are representatives of divine consciousness with free will, and associated with free will is a responsibility, which often we don't hear from the spiritual teacher,
Right.
a responsibility to evolve, for example. Well, if you're talking about people that have been in some way initiated, as you're talking, whether self-initiation or who've gone through a certain thing, that they're open. Yeah, it's difficult to roll back the carpet on that, but that number is, in some senses it's small. And even in a religious context, although they participate ritualistically, some people may not ever come out in that sense of engagement with their full consciousness. Right. But I foresee, and it has been anticipated by some fiction writers, the idea that they could lock consciousness or waking consciousness at some stage, the executive function of the spiritual thing into some frozen state, not of some state that it's in some way confined or put into some, or locked into some system by maintaining it, for example, the brain in a alive state, whatever. And I'm not saying the spirit resolves there, but it could impinge in your ability in some sense until we understand better the final relationship. So yes, I agree that it's incredibly difficult, but they can certainly interfere with our capacity to evolve as we're meant to do.
Right.
So there's a difference between a seed and a flower. We're meant to go, although the flower comes from the seed, we're meant to go through this process. We're meant to go through this cycle of spiritual evolution. And in some ways, they can prevent that effort in relation to that spiritual evolution. So I think they do have designs and interference with spiritual evolution. If I give you, or if you take a drug which interferes with your moral responsibility, the question is there consequences in the universe for that? And most of the spiritual teachers will say, yeah, there is actually. You can't. There's a bit of a problem when I listen to, and I'm not talking about Paul checking this, but when I listen to some people talking about mysticism and spirituality, there's no responsibility in any of it. It's do what you want. It's more magic. Right. Do what they will. It's no, oh yeah, do what's good for you. Go girl. Yeah, you do it. That's okay. Now, unfortunately, that's not what the spiritual traditions say. So it's a relativistic thing. When you say to the people, well, what is it you actually believe in? What are the rules at the base? You know, do you believe that you can't kill, for example? Do you believe in non-violence? Do you really believe in, or is that, well, you know what I mean? It depends on, you know, and then you can get around it, and you can have complex systems, or if things happen in their life, they say, well, that's because of a soul contract that I entered into beforehand, and therefore I'll tolerate this, some nonsense that has happened in the world. So I don't believe that that's, now there's more complicated versions of that, but you can get into a very relativistic situation. And it's funny, where is the center of growth of new spirituality, alternative spirituality in the United States? It's in California. Where is the concentration of the greatest concentration of the military industrial complex? It's in California.
Yep.
Where is the greatest concentration of this military industrial system applied to technology and information? It's in California. And you say, well, that's just a coincidental relationship. Well, I think people should reflect on that and whether that's true. And that you notice that certain religious systems are more desirable to the context than others. So, for example, and it's a bit old when I hear, and I'm not defending any of the traditionalists or whatever. Well, I'm to defend the tradition in this context. For example, it's very, very common now when I hear a lot of spiritual teachers to show their kind of liberal values by saying about the Catholics. You couldn't say that about any other group. Oh, the Catholics this, the Catholics that, and there's a kind of feeding frenzy now on this, and that's fine if people expressing their views. But when you see that this was part of the agenda to destroy the existing institutions because they would stop they would stop the processes, you have to say, well, you have to be a bit careful about being a useful idiot in the way that you express things. And most people, a lot of the people that I hear talking about things, have no idea about where the rights came from, or the history of the evolution of law and the influence of religious principles, or the origins of science in these contexts. And they repeat the mantras of science, rationality, bad, boo, and it becomes ridiculous. Now, that's fine, but there's going to be a price to pay for this. And I'm not saying, I've talked about the church being taken over, by which I believe has happened in many sense, in the Jesuits, etc. Malachi Martin has written about that, and he wrote about the New World Order and explained the process and how it was happening. But for example, in that context, we're talking about 2,000 years of different structures, you know, and the church started off, of course, as an underground movement. It's going underground again, and people, you know, so it's gone underground recently in certain places in Europe because it has to. So nature abhors a vacuum and politics abhors a vacuum. The idea that there's going to be a blank slate of reasonable people to take up the thing is not what's going to happen. So the people that don't understand what game is going on are contributing towards the new scenario. And when they see what they're going to get, because they will see it, there has been a big destruction of institutions, and a number of them will collapse. And especially in this relativistic context, people will be saying, well, where is the law and order? Where is? But these things have been excised. These things have been cut out with people's consent, if you like. And if you look at what Manly Hall talks about in relation to the Faustian bargain, people don't seem to believe that they can engage in a Faustian bargain, meaning that you attain knowledge for giving up your eternal soul, if you believe in that. Now, if you look at the early Christopher Marlowe versions of Faust, it's clear that when he dies, the devils are taking him down, and he's going straight, and he knew that. And but we can do a similar thing, and I'm not saying you have to believe in all that kind of stuff, but if you believe that there's persistence of the spirit afterwards, but the way that we lead our life is important. It's not just the Christians that say that. It's clear in Buddhism, and it's clear in most of the perennial tradition that there are certain rules that are embedded in the universe, and there is a sense of divine justice. We can even see that in near-death experiences, the people that go on and then they have the life review, and they have a sense of the impact of their actions on others. And I believe that's where a lot of justice principles came from, that they were embedded in society because people began to understand this is actually a deeper rule of the universe and of the nature of our beings. So you can't get away from these principles. You can listen to all the Richard Dawkins' selfish gene, deterministic, biological mechanistic view, going back to clockwork idea of the human automaton, etc., projected onto us now. But ultimately, you can't get away from those higher values. So the problem is that we are, on the basis of our failure to believe in some kind of higher order, that we believe there are highest things, we don't believe that there's any negative game. And therefore, in all the little decisions we make and all the contributions we make to this discourse, we are involving ourselves in this loop, really. And we're evolving, we're sticking we're getting sucked into that thought process. And it even happens, you get on the computer and you can see the algorithms are prodding you to look at certain, and they're doing that with kids, and they're doing that with the whole thing. So unless you dismiss the totality of perennial philosophy, you can't really get away from the idea that agenda is really to drag you down into a mechanistic automaton idea where you respond automatically. And now, again, here's another example. I'm not criticizing anybody that has blow-up dolls, sex dolls, robotic dolls, whatever they want. I'm not. But the industrial kind of sex toys industry is 30 billion or worth 30 billion or so. So as we speak, as well as the guys out playing golf, there's a lot of men and women, enjoying themselves with mechanical beings. But I mean, and good, do what they want. That's good luck to them. But there's a continuing substitute. So the natural desire, for example, of perhaps that would have been satisfied by interaction in the communal sense, is satisfied by a robotic thing. And people think there's no consequences. But again, it's that automaticity, instead of having a relationship with someone, well, the business but I mean, it's part of the entire agenda. And then, of course, with all the recent stuff, masks, etc., we become more mechanized. So the only thing I would say is it depends on accepting that you're a spiritual being. The next question is, what does the spiritual being do? And according to a lot of the great mystics or writers like Evelyn Underhill, for example, it's a process of evolution. And for her, it was a Christian thing, though she was very informed of the Indian philosophy and Kabir and all that. And it was the same thing. So it's a matter of that efflorescence of forming the loop with the divine conscious and including with nature, because this is another thing that if you look at the early Christian church, it was the book of Revelation and the book of nature. They were inherently connected to nature, cycles, loops, precipitation loop. And now that we see that they even want to interfere with the weather, to geo-engineer the world, they want to destroy that. And part of that destruction will be to drive the remaining humans into fixed positions, to make them plants, to plant them down, the glass domes that you see in The Simpsons, whatever. This is part of the thing that John Lilly anticipated. Congregation of people, clearances, historical example, the Highland clearances, get all the Gaelic population off the land, make sure they're scattered around the world, concentrate them in cities, and then you can have your sheep there to graze on the land, and put your kilt on and shoot the pheasants and rule it from your castle when you're back from ruling the empire in India and taking all their stuff as well. So this process of clearance, the process of enclosures during the early industrial revolution, etc., land that used to be common, it's a constant thing. So now all these principles are being applied into your mind, into your consciousness, to enclose and capture your consciousness, the land of your consciousness. So the only concern is, uninitiated, you begin to unconsciously make a pact with the system. You're making a pact bit by bit with this being, effectively, because other human minds are in it. So this is becoming a manifestation of a greater being. In spiritual terms, there was always the Adam Kadmon, or Albion for Blake, the idea of a greater spiritual being of which we used to be part of, and then it's reflected in an idea of a spiritual mystical body, and this is an idea that a number of churches use. This has been transformed into a mechanical body, and we're to be part of that, and we're to be a component. And this is what the US military have been working on, to turn the human into a functional component of military automatic systems. And this is what it is. So I agree with that, but I'm not being too hopeful. I think they could do it. I mean, if you can convince someone, take the example, sorry for going on so long, but just give an example. Stop me if I'm banging on too long. Just you got me
I
going.
love it. I love it. You're connecting a lot of dots for me.
Look at what you can do by giving some people certain drugs. Look what you can do to their mind. And the question is, does that affect their spirit? So, for example, we know that Whitey Bulger was engaged in one of these experiments, and that he claims that he was an ordinary decent criminal, if you want to put it like that, an ordinary criminal that became something else. And of course, he's working for the state afterwards as an agent, but they also tested him. Kaczynski was subjected to behavioral tests as well when he was at Harvard, and that changed him in some way. So this interference with the mind by prosthesis, by either mechanical but pharmaceutical ways as well, is very, very simple way to stop people being who they are. Now, our lack of knowledge is down to ourselves. We can't stop certain things. It's just done. But if we are acquiescent in certain things, we do take responsibility. So we do take responsibility. Say, for example, if we take whatever, if we take drugs that make us kill people, for example, we can't avoid the responsibility and blame it on the drug if we have some kind of consciousness. So yes and no. My point is that our failure to have a vision and direction and our acquiescence is because of our lack of commitment to spiritual evolution. And we will pay a price socially, and we may pay a price individually. So yes, we should be hopeful, but uninitiated, where you don't even know what your spirit is, and you've accepted all the propaganda, you've accepted, it may be difficult for you to do so, but you've accepted all the idea that you don't have any spirit, that you don't have even any consciousness, that science is the only truth, everything else is nonsense. nature is dirty, bad, life in the past was bad, well, then you could get into difficulty.
Right. And it's interesting because this mechanical loop is really just feels like an artificial simulation of the loop of consciousness that you just described, right? We're really just
Exactly.
recreating. We're
Yeah.
recreating what we already know to be true about ourselves, but outsourcing it and externalizing it. And what you just described, based on my own I guess beliefs and understanding about the soul, I can see how somebody maybe even, and maybe this is just a personal thought and personal belief, but if even after death, you we believe in the notion of a soul contract, you get so locked into this system and the nature of of man and the nature of spiritual consciousness is continual growth and evolution, right? And if we stagnate ourselves to such a degree within this mechanical loop that we're stuck there for in eternity because we are bypassing the very laws of nature that we would normally be naturally growing, and we would even in our ignorance when we're going out into the world, and maybe we're unconscious of certain actions, there are still moments of growth and self-reflection and introspection that can allow us to learn from that and ultimately move on and have a greater level of awareness, right? And we've all experienced that to a degree, but if you eliminate that self-reflection process and that ability to actually just take a step back, even for just one moment, and have any analysis, you eliminate the actual ability to grow and the ability to change. And you do get sort of stuck in that repetitive loop per se. And, I think that could be something that until that loop is broken, it's something that is eternal. And if you're inside of it, you can't break it because there's no perception that anything exists outside of it, right? So, and if all of mankind is within that loop, well, then it would take something like I don't know, a solar flare or some sort of cataclysmic event to actually wipe out the technology that is enforcing the loop. And then you're just going to have a bunch of people like this kind of paints like some of our origin stories in a way. You just have a bunch of people. It's like, oh, wow, what happened? Like, who are we? And then you almost start the cycle over again, right? And I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
would be that sort of cataclysm would be it would be unfortunate in a lot of ways because I don't think that's not what we're meant. We're not meant to continually repeat this cycle and get caught in that trap, but it seems to be what we're prone to. And the people who are running the show, the circus, they understand that and they're very aware of, I would say, the part of the human being that is the most mechanical is the mind, in the way that it works in a sense because we can get so trapped within it, and so they play to that mechanic, um, that essence of what the mind does and that rationalization process, and that way it can be exploited to hyper fixate on a particular worldview or concept, right? And I don't know what that necessarily means for the future. I mean, I like to have hope just because I'm an individual sovereign being, and as long as I have my perception, I think that's a reason to have hope, right? But at the same time, I definitely agree with you in the sense that we're gonna have to pay the bill, if you will. Like we've been eating at an expensive table, and it's going to
Mm.
certainly going to cost us. And I think we're already beginning to feel the impacts of that. Like we're already starting to recognize it, but uh, I don't know if people, because I still see a lot of people who want to, fix the economy and this and that, or they very attached to the way the system is, or like there's this idea we can go back to how things were prior to 2020. And to me, that seems very disillusioned to the larger agenda at play here. And certainly 2020 was a year of um I guess where this really began to play out in a sense where maybe we did have certain freedoms that existed you know, the last century that maybe aren't present right now, right?
Mm,
But at the same time, there has to be that transition point where that infringement starts, right? And so
mm,
there's no going back, because the infringement upon our natural, I would say, natural rights and
mm,
natural law it's already begun, and so you can't go back on that. So
mm.
I don't know. I think we need to
Yeah,
really,
well, I mean, when you're talking about trial by jury, for example, you're going back hundreds of years, the Magna Carta, and these are rights that people fought. I mean, the barons fighting for them, and the right for merchants to travel unimpeded, for example. These are rights that they fought for, and that people never respected their existence. And they were, well, really, there will be in the overall reckoning, unfortunately, for the last couple of generations, a kind of cosmic cost in particular, because they were seduced by this idea, this unhistorical idea, that they could spend all their time paying attention to nonsense, and my generation as well, paying attention to nonsense, soap operas, instead of cleansing the doors of perception,
yeah,
cleansing, cleaning your house, and using the so a lot of these techniques. Character merchandising came from soap companies, Pears, etc. Going back to London again, opposite the British Museum was where they were at one stage. If we go back long enough, you mentioned circus, and of course, circus is a circuit again, as well as the
yeah,
electric. So Indy 500, go and watch the thing going around. The Romans, the circus, Max, the thing is going around and around. This is what you do in a hypnosis. Watch my finger, Evan. Watch my finger again. And this is it's part of the process. They go together. The circuit, the attention, getting your attention. Attention is the basis of worship. What you pay attention to, you worship. If your life is determined by Friends, meaning the TV program, Friends, and American football, whatever, that's what you begin to worship. In Britain, Ireland, and here as well, a lot of people pay attention to the Manchester United, Manchester United, Liverpool, whatever, Manchester City. They effectively worship them. I know
yeah,
people that is the most meaningful thing in their lives. That's worship. So you pay a price for that. That's great. You get all your satisfaction, from that strange relationship, which I don't understand. I did when I was a kid. I don't understand it now, especially when they don't even have any connection with the local area. They're
yeah.
they're billionaires and millionaires, and you're supposed to give all your money and then go and shout. I just don't get it. I can understand cultural context, like going to hear Celtic, for example, and the history behind it. And I understand that, but and even the square in boxing is called a ring.
Yeah.
You know, it's there. It's a loop of your attention. And look at the octagon of the UFC. It's an interesting thing that people haven't commented on, the success of the UFC, and I'm interested in that, in martial arts. But the greatest period, if you like, in boxing and public attention to boxing. We go back to the famous fights of Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney. It was just before the Wall Street crash, and even when we go back and look at some of the big eras in boxing, attention is focused on these things just before a crash. So I wonder
Mm,
sometimes whether the current interest in growth and rapid growth in the last few years has something got to do also with a sense of sublimation. Oh, we're projecting into the ring deeper things that we're not going to engage. Well, I do a bit of stuff
mm,
now and then, but there is a kind of sublimation process there, and I think there's a deeper level on the loop as well. There's a profound loop theory about the origin of the cosmos on that, an explanation. DNA growth and epigenetics is based on a loop. It's a loop of within the DNA process. They make loops to work. And there's also the parasitic nature of the loop. We know that certain animals can be taken over by other entities, parasites, like in the certain insects, a parasite comes in and enters in a region where you wouldn't want them entering, and can find a place in the brain that makes them act in a way which is inconsistent with their own interests. So they can lay their eggs. They can make, or in rats, they can make rats become unafraid. This parasite of cats, so they endanger their life. So we know that nature itself can take over the brain and make people do things that it doesn't want to do. And scientists know this as well. So there is if one believes in some kind of, obviously you can't do anything about those things if they happen. But if you do believe that we're meant to evolve in some way, it's clear also that there's processes of interference in that. And if you look at the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Bardo plane, if you look at the grey world of Evelyn Underhill, or if you look at the plane of ghosts in Surawardi, there is a common idea that there is a place which people kind of, the grey world is a good description, where people are in a kind of limbo. And Evelyn Underhill seems to see this as part of the natural order. It's not the supernatural order, but where the spirit, which is ill-defined, not focused, directionless, wanders around. And this is in all the cultures, so a lot of the cultures. So it's not a new idea. It's even in the Christian context, in some ways, you could say, a bit in the limbo or purgatory or whatever. But there's an idea of an unevolved state, independently of the hell bit, which is there as well. Now, I'm not saying that to terrorize people or to be, but there is a sense of, as well as divine rules somewhere, of divine consequences. Yeah. And we know that you can't mess around with nature. If you begin to do things, there are consequences, and there are the same things in relation to spiritual process or consciousness. There's things happen if you do certain things. Now, it's only because we have believed that our will is not important, that we should obey someone. And all the military systems are based on obedience. So you can get people to do what you want. You're in this machine. What you have to do is obey these systems. And once you do, you begin to sacrifice your will, and not only your will, but so for example, we say, listen, there's a new war going on. It threatens our existence overseas, Evan. We want you to sign up. We're going to send you out there, and you'll be doing, the president will greet you when you come back, or whatever, or you can, well, not, hopefully not that good, but you're going to get celebrated. You get some special deals.
Get a nice parade.
Able to give and whatever. And no disrespect to the people that do that. But there's a certain point you say, well, hold on a second. What is it that you're doing over in Libya? What is it that you're doing over? What were you doing over in Afghanistan? What was that about? What was that? And I'm not criticizing, I'm criticizing the people that control them. But there's also a point that if you're dragged into the system and you have to do things that you don't want to do, but you're forced to do it from the system because you have to behave automatically, you have to behave like an automaton to be a soldier. That's what a soldier is in the context. You're part of a machine, you're part of a military industrial complex, or you have to press the button to kill the people with the drones far away, or you have to, in your mind, torture the people as they've been doing in the cases for this system. Well, you can either believe there's no consequences for that. Well, then why should there be consequence for anything? Then you get into that relativistic thing, yeah. And it's our easy succumbing to some of these things that raise the question that, well, if you believe in something afterwards, do you believe that what you did in this life has no consequence? Now, of course, they say, well, what about the Bhagavad Gita and are you in the military? I understand that, and doing duty. I understand that. I'm not saying that there's not subtleties in the thing, but there's a simpler point about the people doing their duty and how they do their duty. And I'm not saying, of course, we want people to defend ourselves, but we do have to get a bit suspicious, especially in the United States, about the intervention and a whole range of things. And a lot of people don't know about their interventions in particular places and the degree, to the extent to which they have provoked this loop of violence, and then that they present themselves as our protectors when they go intervening and using the instruments to achieve particular purpose. And that's a continual one, and that's another circus as well, because they know how to manipulate the circle. And you hear again and again and again about, oh yeah, well, you have to encounter your dark side, and you have to do this. We have to understand our shadow, and those same people then are repeating the propaganda they hear. So what I'm saying out of that, the positive point is that really it demands that we wake up our left brain and our right brain and our spirit as well. We have to use our brain, engage it, have a panoramic view, work on it, dedicate our attention to it, look at the links, study the difficult things, learn them, be familiar with the things, be able to argue about, be able to discuss, be able to look at the philosophical basis as well as the spiritual thing, because we're complex whole beings. And we have a responsibility individually, if you believe that you have a spiritual thing, to recognize that other people's spiritual complex consciousness and the complex beings that we have to facilitate some way, not beat them about the head, but by exemplars and by encouragement, heart, and care to facilitate growth. And the more we do that individually, the greater opportunity we have of creating a mycelium, like the sprouting mushroom of connections between people. And we begin to influence each other, and we begin to learn off each other, and get strength and power and ability to form connections that then can begin to affect other people that are in systems, that can make decisions, that can begin to look at what the whole system is, where it's going, why are we spending so much money on these things, why do we want to destroy ourselves, who are these people, why are we giving our power to them, all those issues. But they only come from that opening up. And but I do believe that there are consequences for actions. It doesn't, and breaking the loop, you're right. The only solutions to these things are breaking those loops. But if we don't recognize that they're there, we can't break them. And C.S. Lewis put it very well when he said, I think it was called The Inner Ring, in a speech that he gave. He said, it was to students when they're graduating. And he concluded by saying 9 of 10 of you will become integrated into the system. And he said, it doesn't happen suddenly. It may happen when you're in the job, and the nice person who you don't want to offend or you don't want to disappoint, who has recognized your abilities, begins to ask you to do some little thing that you're informed that everyone else does, and it's well done. And you begin, and it's little by little. And he said, by those little steps, you're taken into the system. It doesn't necessarily happen by Mephistopheles or whatever appearing before you and saying, here's the contract, you take it, or whatever like that. Although that system is would be believed by esoteric people to exist as well. But in its ordinary context, it's little by little being convinced that what you believe or what your conscience tells you is taken away, and you're sucked into a system where it's difficult to get out of that loop. And in its more pronounced forms, you want to become a made man in the mafia, you sign up for the rule, and you leave your conscience at the door, and you're an automaton for that system. But that's only a Machiavellian kind of explanation of a thing that happens for everyone in their whole lives, how they use technology, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And how business is conducted, how all aspects of life really revolve around what you just
Yeah.
described. And it's interesting because I look at the present times, and you mentioned sort of the infiltration of like a parasite, for example, right? And, a parasite can take over in nature, and that almost eliminates the free conscious will of the initial inhabitant. And I feel like that's what we have witnessed in a lot of ways. I mean, it reminds me of Paul Levy talks about the Wetiko virus, right? And that sort of the virus of the collective mind in a sense. And I would say that's certainly it spills down into the individual mind. But I recently did a parasite cleanse after I got Paul Chek's book, How to Eat, Move, and Be
Okay.
Healthy. And
Yeah.
so he was talking about parasite cleanses in it. And I was like, oh, let me do a parasite cleanse. But I even noticed, you know, during the cleanse, my thoughts becoming clearer. Like there are certain, like the totality of my health greatly improved, but it was my own mental state that the switch And it's not something I necessarily even know if I have the right words for, but I noticed there was definitely more clarity in my own conscious intentions and my own conscious will, right? And so
Mm,
we have these parasitic, I would say, ideologies that are pathogens and parasitic. The system is a parasitic entity that has infiltrated with its ideologies, with its um, how we conduct ourselves on a daily basis, and now we are caught within the reins of the parasite, and you almost have to cleanse the parasite itself from inside of you to even um, break free from it. I mean, but that's the thing. Without I guess some sort of parasitic cleanse that can take place on a more collective scale, I don't know if that's actually achievable, because a lot of times in nature, when a parasite takes over, that is the death of that particular initial animal, right? Or that it is no longer able to operate until that parasite is finished with whatever business it's doing, and oftentimes the animal will just die. Like it's so um, it's interesting because I do think this really amounts to a parasite in a lot of ways, and how parasites operate, and the nature that they have, where they are just serving themselves as the host, the parasite, like and they take over the host. The host isn't getting anything from it, but they don't realize they're not get. They don't even necessarily realize that it's there, but
mm,
their actions are confiscated, and that really, I think, mirrors, kind of holds a mirror to where a lot of people are at. Their spiritual consciousness has been infiltrated with the parasitic mind virus of scientific materialism, of this sort of half truth laced form of spirit. And I don't even necessarily would call it spirit, but it's the rational mind, the ego, identity, all of these different ideas of how the world operates on a material sense. And
mm.
now we are really just big meat suits walking around, automatons with no grander purpose or connection to the totality. And I think that to me
Mm.
feels like sort of the root of where people are at. And I
Yeah,
think,
well, the Levy's idea comes from, I imagine, from the Native American idea of the Wendigo.
yeah,
That's the basis of it. So this is a classic idea of spiritual possession, and particularly the Algonquins or the Ojibways, whatever, have this idea, and they know about this. So it's there for a while, or it's there for a long time. Um, it can also be applied in a relativistic way. It can also be applied in a way which is kind of saying, well, you're the problem, Evan. You know, it's you. It's not the military-industrial complex. And this is the thing I see in some of the Jungian things. Well, you have to look inside yourself and you'll solve the world. No, you look inside yourself for spiritual evolution, and then you can go. And the mystics say you have to go through that journey in order to contribute. But the things out there are not caused by individual, the individual doing it. There's these forces out there that are autonomous forces. That can't be denied. So sometimes there's a slightly relativistic thing in this. Oh, it's all us. It's not all us. It's we're affected by it, but there's a force out there that we have to recognize. And the connection between, say, the Wendigo or the Waitiko or the parasites is possession of free will. This is the same as in the Catholic Church, or of spiritual possession. And there's a similarity between them. One is a immaterial force in many senses, but so then are the information that we get when we're communicating with these things. They're information elements. And this working through an algorithm and a loop on our brain is a similar thing to that. We get possessed with an idea. Fundamentalism is ideological, which means that our worldview is total and it's possessed by a worldview. Everything is rationalized in a certain religious view, or fundamentalism in science or whatever. It's a total loop. And of course, the loop of control on a macro level will be a total global loop. That's what it's set up to do. So the possession idea is important. One of the things that set me off I think it's important to follow. You get onto a thread and you should pull it and see where it goes. And one of the ones that I started off years ago when you're talking about cleansing and all that was I began to understand when nobody was really talking about when I was young about sugar.
Mm.
And I couldn't figure out, and I was saying, you began to understand that, okay, well, this stuff is not good for your body. And I began to understand the consequence. And you say, well, okay, you have this stuff can rot the hardest things in your body, in your teeth. You say, well, who's, and I began to look at these processes and wonder why, as a kid, why are, these people that you assume are doing a good thing, selling you this rubbish. Now, this is a contemporary problem in London. Loads of shops have closed down, and they've opened up with these super sweet companies for kids that are sold in conjunction. Apparently, there's an article in the Daily Mail about it's parasitic of TikTok. So they utilize these things to promote these horrendous stuff that the kids now are kind of programmed to want, and it'll do damage to them. So then you follow the sugar and you look back and you see you're straight back to the slave trade. The slave trade was fundamentally associated with sugar. And you begin to, well, why was this? You begin to understand the way certain tools are utilized, and even how they scientifically understood about tooth decay. They did experiments in Sweden on people that were in a mental asylum, on people that had, say now, learning difficulties, and they gave them sweets, intensive amounts, and they deliberately rotted their teeth. So the poor unfortunates who'd lost the capacity for control over their own lives were then subject to scientific investigation, and that's where a lot of the knowledge came from. From another classic example of that kind of nefarious scientific, unethical loop. It's a shocking story, but and then they say, oh well, we can take the good out of it. Okay, it was not, So this is a classic idea. So well, Blake talked about cleansing the doors of perception. It's in the Christian thinking about taking away the thing before your eyes, and so you can see properly. And this is a literal thing. And of course, we're talking about the spiritual eyes, but there's an extra consequence in the way we see the world. But so your spiritual eyes can be covered, and you have to uncover those spiritual eyes and to see the world in a deeper context. And that leads to an ability to question what's going on. Evelyn Underhill, in a book on mysticism, constantly stresses the idea that mystics are not people that go off and live in a cave. They're people that go out and live in a cave and come back and influence society. And this is where Maslow's idea, the self-actualized person, the reason why he began to study these people is because he was wondering, why are these people so successful at what they do and content and happy? And then he found the basis of this mystical experience that he couldn't actually go further with it, but he found that it was there. And then he was going to write about plateau experience, and this is consistent with mystical literature and perennial philosophy, is that once you reach a certain stage and you've been punching holes in the next level, eventually you'll go to the next level where you're kind of amphibious. You can enter into the normal world in a very enhanced way, but still have your spiritual connection with the spirit, or the man of light, the Suravadi, or the woman of light that exists, the second person. So there's a connection with our spiritual sense, our fuller spiritual sense, which is seen in many traditions as a separate, higher spiritual force, a twin, if you like, or it could be regarded as a guardian angel. So what this agenda seeks to do is to cut off that connection and create a simulacrum to something that you think you are, and begin to interrupt, and certainly not to deny your consciousness here and to deny any other higher consciousness. And ironically, the people that usually lead the great inventions, or Tesla and all those, not only did they understand the circuits, because that's what he was talking about, and alternating currents and direct current and the difference between them, and again, but current, circuit, but he also understood the openness, the fact that was there, that this process is there for us to communicate, not just physically use, but in that wider sense that Surawardi talked about, revelation coming, being available as an epistemological source, independently of things we come across. We can have this intuition, a higher intuition. So we can't get both of them, but if we sacrifice ourselves to one model, we don't get the other model of current, for example. And that's, again, that circuit, this is what they're doing. Now they know they can program in a message, whatever, orange man, bad, whatever, and they can and they can measure it, and they can refine it, or whatever, something about that thing that we won't mention anymore, or what's happening in Russia or Ukraine or whatever it is, that can be programmed into the system, and it will move like a circuit through the system, because the people attached to these things are part of the system, and it moves through the currents move. So current affairs, it really is a current of information, and then people act on that, and that takes away the autonomous aspect of our own individuality.
Right, definitely. And it seems each day as they announce these more and more, you look at like the Davos 2022, and they talk about, I already mentioned that they're implementing technology inside the individual, right? It seems as we move further along, that autonomy grows smaller and smaller within the individual's point of awareness. I was wondering if you think there is like a technological point of no return for the individuals, right? I mean, there's a lot of people, for example, who maybe have gotten the shot, the word we won't use, like the big old V word. And, they are like, oh no, am I now connected to the smart grid? Like there's people who have waken up after taking it, right? And they realize what they may have done, right? What are your thoughts on this continuing rollout that we're going to see over the next few years? Because I don't think there's going to necessarily be one point where the whole thing comes crashing down and all of a sudden we're in the purgatory in the sense, and we're within the confines of the system, right? This is something that's slowly being implemented, and right now I think we're in a destruction phase of our current some of the current models are being destroyed, and they're going to quote unquote build back better into this new technocratic reality. But I think they're doing it at a pace to where we're never going to feel completely overwhelmed by the sheer chaos. I mean, maybe if we're not complying with it, we will. Or there's a certain level of non-compliance that might lead to hardship as well. But that's what I mean. You're willing to endure for your own sovereignty. But at the same time, for those complying and going along, I don't know if it's going to reach that stage, and just simply complying will lead somebody into this sort of enslaved state without realizing. I don't think we're at a point of no return for most people. I think if you were to convey the information in the right way, they could still find the part within themselves that would understand the truth of their spiritual consciousness. I don't think it's been completely severed yet. I mean, certain individual instances that may be true. I've certainly seen people where it appears as such, but I don't want to give up on them. So, I mean, what do you think that looks like over the next few years, and if there is a definitive point of no return in your eyes?
Well, it's quite amazing. Say, for example, I don't get into Swedish politics or Swedish affairs, but just as an example, according to numerous surveys, most people in the official Church of Sweden, they don't believe in God, for example. I mean, it seems like a strange concept. That happens with established churches, and that's similar in a number of the established or old established churches. They do it out of habit, or they're still subscribed in some way, and or even in you'd say similar things in the Anglican context, or people remain the church structure, but they're pure materialists, and they say, okay, we'll achieve social function. So therefore, in a number of countries, I mean, there's a Sweden has high percentage of atheism, but also has a a growing population of Muslims, for example. So we will see a change where Islam will be a dominant religion in a number of European countries. So that Christian element disappears. And in a number of countries, there will be just pure kind of atheism or the religion of science, because there will be a church of science, a religion of science turned into with the use of, they know that was what the Good Friday experiments, going back to those experiments with psychedelics, religious experience. And I believe they intend to create some kind of religious structure that incorporates kind of high level psychological stuff. That can certainly happen. So there's a different response, but then you have to say, well, what's the agenda then in relation to this destruction of Christianity? So if you take a pessimistic view, you can say, well, there was an attempt to destroy Judaism. There's certainly an attempt to destroy Christianity, and it's doing very well. It's doing very well. I mean, it's clearing out religious belief in a lot of countries in Europe. So Islam is different in that it's retaining a bit more. But then, for example, you have to say, like it's never reported. It was never reported about. There's old churches in Norway that were burned down. They were from the 1200s. That were burned down by heavy metal gangs and things like this. I mean, they just burned them down. Church burnings are common now in Canada. And the prime minister, said, well, he understands it, and so this is the end of the Reformation. This is really removing things, and a lot of propaganda associated as well. People are going to pay a price for that. They think, oh, well, that's just something that's happening, and they fail to see the link between that and the cultural context. Because where do your rights come? Your rights came through a process which were based on the dignity of the individual, and that when you take that, Matt, it's just back to regulation. So that's what they're trying to do. And the new international rules-based order moves away from international law and commitments to that. So they have been doing that for a while, but everyone has relinquished. They repeat all these things. They repeat all how bad. I'm not saying about there wasn't a bad side there in Christianity. But I mean, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In relation to a lot of contributions to culture and where the cultural things came from. So in relation to a lot of the issues that we're debating and this polarization, if you look at, for example, I remember reading books about trans rights and transgender and articles when they were just coming on the first time, and there was a law student, there was nothing really in the literature, and then they began to come through. And now if you look at and Google engram and trans rights, the graph up, this is not an issue about people making choices. It's an issue about how they play certain issues and emphasize certain issues. And of course, that suits the idea of transhumanism and transness and the mutability. I'm genuinely not making any issue about individuals and what they want to do with their body and their life and how they feel. I'm not at all. But I do think they may be used as well to create divisions, and this is a constant thing, creating divisions between people, and clever people fall into all these separations. So entertainment is the holding of your attention, and associated with entertainment is the projection of things that hold your attention, that hold your time. And when you're paying attention to that, you're distracted, and all trickery is based on distraction. All pickpocketing and taking, once they focus your attention on something, they can do other things. And you could chart these taking away of powers with the focus on inane stuff, on stuff that's not relevant, and the way things are projected in the media at certain times and made available to distract the public because they know what we're interested in. I believe that I appeal to everybody in relation to their spiritual consciousness, but I know that it's a very limited appeal, and I don't have any doubt about that. So what's going to happen is that there are many people that will not go, and they will condemn themselves or their descendants to that path towards integration with that collective consciousness in a mechanical way. I mean, there will be no going back at a certain stage when you have lost the capacity to make individual decisions. I don't really see how you can, go beyond that, especially if the little chip, which may be implanted surreptitiously, utilizing graphene elements that can change state, for example, and implanted, you begin to lose the capacity to resist that and to make choices consistent. And it begins to tell you what to do. So I don't see how that can be avoided. In relation to the people that are staying outside the loop as far as possible, well, certainly they will have to form connections in order to. The parallel society, as it's been put forward, is not going to work. And even the examples they utilize of what happened in Czechoslovakia and Central Europe, there's alternative readings of how successful that was, and that ultimately that wasn't the key thing, although certainly the Catholic Church structure what was important in changing what happened there, which is often underestimated. But that structure is breaking down now, and been deliberately breaking down. So we don't have any possible counterforce, and that's why the Catholic Church had to really be removed as a player, a significant player, because it was one of the bodies that had the organizational capacity to be able to resist things. So the individuals that stay outside will be often, they will be underground churches, for example. There will be people that are committed genuinely to the environment. There will be people, native people who have seen this before and more recently. There will be people who are critical. There will be people who have been involved in the process and understand what's happening. There will be mathematicians that say, okay, I understand that this is, this is what the world is, but actually there's a bigger thing, that this has Gödel and them said it's incomplete, there's something else. An example of George Price and a famous story when in the Galton laboratory, and this is interesting. So this is the center of eugenics in UCL in London by Russell Square behind the British Museum. And a guy walks in and he says, just about the turn of the 70s, at the end of the 60s, and he comes in, they thought he's a kind of tramp, and he says, I have a mathematical solution to explain what altruism is. And then they eventually give him a job because he's George Price. He's a genius that worked on the Manhattan Project, left America, left his family, came to London. Not a good thing to do, but he came to London, and he was looking at the evolution of evolutionary theory and the work of Hamilton and people that influenced that fundamentalist Richard Dawkins. And he was saying, no, that's not quite right. And he was kind of working to tweak the system to explain why, in an evolutionary context, altruism was really selfish. I mean, this is the inversion, Now, I'm not saying necessarily a bad thing about him, but he went through a variety of mystical experiences, and as a result of that, and he had medical problems and a number of things going on. But so he goes around London, and he decides, after his paper is published, in particular, he seems to be going around London and giving things away to down and outs. And he's given all these, and seems to be trying to prove in some way that selfish thing was wrong. And unfortunately, eventually he commits suicide, and he's buried in the same place where Mary Shelley's, another connection, a loop, mother is buried, where she used to go when she was a kid to see her mother's grave, Mary Wollstonecraft, who died as a result of bad medical intervention. The surgeons who wouldn't wash their hands when she was given childbirth, and she died from that horrible disease because of, again, this loop of intervention by supposedly intelligent scientific people who interfered in the previous loops that were there, where women used to help giving birth, but because of the fact that the doctors used to come from the corpses into the birth and things, they spread diseases which caused a lot of problems, which took a long time for people to understand. But anyway, George Price was working on the altruism idea, because this is a critical idea, that why are people altruistic? And if you're an evolutionary theorist, you have to explain that away. You have to explain why someone would sacrifice their life for somebody else. And they do have all these, they've concocted all these daft explanations, but they can't tolerate the idea that altruism exists, that people are kind, that people are compassionate, that there is this force that they have, which is part of their consciousness, which is inherently part of their nature, which is cooperative, which is what all human society has been until these systems began to substitute this competition, destructive model. We've always been cooperative. People have always been, as well as the bad bit, they've always been nice to each other as well. And they used to talk to each other, and they used to talk to each other when they were traveling, as opposed to being on the machine and automatically. They used to talk to find out stories and share stories. So they can't handle this altruism. And even with altruism as a concept only came in the 1860s again, the same era. Altruism was invented as part of this, funny enough, as Compton trying to establish a model for society. So they invent a concept because they won't accept the prior existing compassion and Buddhist or Indian notions, or Native American theology or Celtic notions. So they invent the notion of altruism in the 1860s. 100 years later, they say, well, no, it doesn't really exist. And this is the classic thing. They cut it away. So it's a Procrustean attempt. It's like Procrustes that made the people fit into the bed. It's like Stephen King's that story, where the woman has the man and the writer in the bed, and she breaks his feet so he won't be able to escape. This is what they're doing. They're fitting us into a model. So the spiritual idea, the revolutionary nature of the Buddhist idea or the Christian idea or the various Indian philosophers, to go back to Kabir or Guru Nanak or any of those ideas, is that part of our consciousness is creative. We're reflective of the divine being. So we are creative, and we're also compassionate or merciful. That's what in Islam, mercifulness is fundamentally associated with the higher force. So in ourselves, in our heart, we open up to the higher force. That's where the religious automaticity, it's a voluntary opening up to the force. And Lucas anticipated some of this in his student film in the 60s, about a society run by machines where we're drugged and constrained on the ground, was perhaps the basis of his reimagination of mythology, where we had the empire and the force. It really does anticipate the what I call the empire of scientism, and the force represents the spiritual in us, the mystical potential, and it's that which is the thing that we have to invoke and apply to the context. So there is a split. There's going to be a split, and there can be a split even without that. If you're in a totalitarian system and you become part of the system, as you kind of have to, but an active part of the system, and you join the party or whatever, or you're involved in the pogroms, or you're involved in the elimination of millions of people, like a lot of young people have no idea about the history of what happened in China or what happened in the Soviet. They have no idea, and we don't have to go that far back, because there's, according to people that were in the weather underground in the United States, which is nice and all that, and Timothy Leary and all that. One of them said that they were. He remembers attending meetings where there was people planning to what they do to get rid of 20 million people in the United States. So I mean, this is in human lifetime in the United States. So one of the the other point is that it's very, very possible that we're going to witness, and I don't want to make people too depressed about that, but it's very possible that we're going to witness something which is beyond awful, that is incomprehensible. That's very possible. So we have to now that could cleanse the doors of perception easily, but unfortunately, many people will be inundated by the force of that. But there will be people that will survive, and there will be spiritual things in whatever context. That's true. There's always going to be Alexander Solzhenitsyn or something who comes out of the Gulag archipelago. There's always going to be that. All the stories in the Christian context is Christians against an empire. The empire hasn't gone away, as Philip K. Dick talked about. But the capacity of the empire, it's refining itself, it's working over time to get better at controlling us. And it's getting good at that. And if you look at the rise of behaviorism from about 1913 for a number of generations, which moved into cybernetics, that was what the psychologists were working at. All these clever scientific people were working to see how could the human animal be modeled so they could control them better, utilizing an idea of how natural organisms worked and how machines worked. So that's what they were doing. They were helping that military industrial system become more effective at managing us. So there's greater odds. The implication is that the people that are going to survive spiritually have to work harder and be more disciplined. So there is a process which is in Evelyn Underhill's terms, where purgation, it's that cleansing process where you do have to, or removal of attachments. It's that process of putting yourself in a better position. It's a constant thing. It's a constant process. We can't live in a cave and function in the world and influence it. So we have to dance with the devil to a certain extent, but that requires that we be more aware and more focused on who we are. And so it may be that cross or that split has happened. That the really, because this is a different species that's emerging. It's not Homo sapiens. Now, I do believe that the other crowd, which I'd call the good crowd, they have to evolve. This is the whole point. This is what it's saying, that it's a failure to evolve it's spiritually evolve. It's the failure to spiritually evolve that is the cause. And that's what I identify inside the mystical accord as the basis of all the work I've done. That it's the failure of spiritual evolution. That has to be first individual, and that can be projected onto other individuals. And in many ways, the fact that we are limited to a flat organization is better. There's an implication in that the big churches are going to be taken over. They're being sold off. There's been billions will be, for example, transferred from the Irish religious organizations. They're sold off. There's hundreds of Anglican churches being closed down. It's a divestment, privatization, a relinquishing of power, which suits the agenda that many are involved in that do. So those options are not going to be there to restore it. They're gone. So the point will be that any, if you like, genuine Christianity will be flat now. It will be a horizontal organization without the big things. That's not going to happen in the same way. And people, for example, there was many Twitter or stuff, etc. At the time Notre Dame was burned down, people saying, "Oh, that's great," and I mean, it was quite amazing that people could celebrate that loss of even cultural heritage. But there's not much going back on that. Whatever revivification happens, there will be a period, and there is a period, where spiritual traditions are going underground. And the last point on that, but the Islamic Christian thing, it would suit the purposes of the New World Order to create a religious war between Islam and Christianity, Romanian Christianity. That would suit its purposes perfectly, because that would justify the argument that religion is the cause of all wars, which is not. And therefore, it would also remove centers of opposition. So Islam is not going to, it will in the short term be seen to expand, but the model is really what's happening to the Muslims in China. That's what's going to happen, because it's a materialist globalist governance system against any spiritual tradition, which is why I emphasize we have to look at the commonality between the traditions. We have to make bridges between spiritual, non-spiritual tradition and find a commonality and not be divided and not be have a not repeat simple views we hear that say about Islam or about and there's also manipulation on the edges. They're played on the edges too by these things to make horrific things happen as well. There's all those elements. So I'm saying that the bright ones in Islam and Protestantism, Catholicism, atheists, agnostics, whoever they are, Buddhists, Taoists, tantric practitioners, we have to kind of unite above that in that divine space and find a commonality which is based on our spiritual possibilities and not be played by this system, not be played automatically, not to become a part of it where we're repeating things that we know nothing about, we read nothing about, we have no experience of the people, and we repeat this nonsense that is programmed into us. Sorry, I went on a bit long there in the
No, that's great. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head, in my opinion, and reiterated a lot of what I've been thinking as well, in the sense that we really do need to go beyond our current, I would say, identification with the boxes that we're used to confining ourselves in, because that is what stagnates spiritual growth and has led us to the point that we're in now. I mean, we have to actually kind of take responsibility. There's certain things that have been out of our hands, but we kind of have to take responsibility of all that's happening, is we've allowed it to happen through our own acquiescence and compliance. I mean, maybe we've spent our lives actually seeking to explore and uncover, but there's always deeper levels of responsibility that we can even take, and recognize how we maybe play into certain divides or certain divisions, and contribute to this sort of machine. I mean, to completely disconnect oneself from the machine, it's nearly impossible in this day and age. I mean, here we are sitting on the zoo of Zoom, and we're kind of playing into the technological machine by having the
well,
conversation.
we're allowed to, yeah.
Right, exactly. But
Yeah.
I mean, you can kind of look at what the return of that is. We're giving people the gift of the conversation and the to insight and learn and to grow. So I mean, it's just sort of about being conscious in our actions, even when we're acting within it, and sort of using the maybe some of the technology or some of the ideas to further understand, and possibly in a way, we're using the technology to detach ourselves from it on a deeper level. Like that's ideally the situation we're creating. But for in terms of the future, I heard the saying, and I might have been David Icke or somebody, who said, if you want to know the West today, just look, or the West tomorrow, just look at China today, right? And they're sort of the, I would say, center for the plan for mankind. Really, they sort of already have that technocratic surveillance, the smart, whatever you want to call it, that technocratic totalitarian system is already in place there. And there's a reason that all of our institutions really bow down to China. You don't hear too much criticism of China. I mean, you might hear it here and there, but not to any degree that is actually going to stand up to it. It's sort of more of the passive, like, oh, maybe they shouldn't be doing that, but you don't see the USA sanctioning China when the way that they're trying to sanction Russia. Not that sanctions does much, anyways, but it's sort of the point of that's the you can recognize that the web of all of this global governance, they're all interconnected already. Like that web is already existent. Like you already said, national sovereignty, I feel at this point is primarily an illusion. I mean, there's a the politicians that we're seeing they're all placed, they're all puppets, they're all playing to this agenda. And so I think it is about rising above our perceived differences and recognizing how much we all have in common as individuals. And what is it that we actually want to work for? What is our dream? What is the idea of an optimized and beautiful world? Because there's so much beauty that we could create, and there's so much there. I like to imagine, what is that standard if we were to actually create a system that mirrored that beauty and mirrored who we are on a deeper level with spiritual consciousness. I mean, it's almost unimaginable compared to what we're living in now. Like it's gonna be radically different. So we really do need to drop our dependencies and drop our ideas of how we think others should act in particular. Drop our beliefs and really step into a deeper level of responsibility and a deeper level of our values, and finding those shared values and those shared dreams, and creating the change. Because I think that's really all we can do at the moment. It's difficult for one individual to come up with, when they're up against the whole system, to come up with something that's going to invert that system that already has so much strength and power. And I know that might be an overwhelming thought for some people, to recognize maybe we can't just snap our fingers and this is all going to change overnight. But I mean, we can still do our part and actually work to free ourselves from the grip of our dependencies.
Hmm. But individuals change history as well. I mean,
Yeah.
the individuals do that, and individuals can make bad history as well. They can start the process. So people have to really believe, and that's where the power of consciousness comes from. If people really believe that their identity is spiritual consciousness, so this is the stuff that is of the divine consciousness, of the greatest creative potential in the world. Now, that's what inventors understand, and that's what artists or prophets or whatever understand about that connection. So part of the benefit of the cities or whatever like that, or is the increased perception and clarity that enables people to act in a self-actualized way, as proven by psychology and that in the world. When you mentioned about China, for example, I remember stopping a fight in a pub when I was a lecturer because somebody had proposed that China was getting more powerful, and it got into a fight. So I was stopping two people fighting over this because it appeared to be ridiculous at the time. So this thing is a bit of a it's a very recent phenomenon, and China would be nothing without the United States. So you cannot get away from that. Even going back to Mao Zedong, China was facilitated in some senses by its connection with the United States. And if you think that all that technology came from in China, you'd be sadly mistaken. So, and even on other issues, and this is no justification for the Japanese or what they did, but there's a bit of a different concentration on what the Japanese did. And Yukio Mishima, who committed ritual suicide outside the imperial palace, the artist and the playwright, who was from a samurai tradition. He couldn't understand. He believed that the Americans had commercialized China and taken away its soul, as happened in other countries. But what he couldn't understand was that he believed that Japan was fighting against communism, and therefore why didn't the United States intervene to support Japan? Going back to Manchuria. Now, I'm not getting into the issue. I'm just saying that some of the historical things only make sense when you realize that this was an agenda to establish global technocracy, where this is a training ground. And if you look at Brzezinski and look at the Nixon era and their rapprochement with China, and Brzezinski is there, and he's the person that wants the technocratic society that sees the techno structure, the techno scientific agenda. So really, the story might be in reverse of what people have been believed it to be, because that was always the problem in China, that in recent times, the scientific revolution happened in Europe. And the question is always, well, why did it happen in Europe? And one of the reasons is because of its theological roots and Judeo-Christian exploration and creativity that fit into the other equation. There's that book, why did the scientific revolution happen in Europe? There's great explorations of that, but that's one of the reasons. So this regime in China couldn't have happened without the support of the international community. Where were the sanctions in relation to this? Where are the protests? No, it's just wanting to sell its technology, although a bit reluctant because they might rob their intellectual property, allowing the money to be utilized to buy companies in the United States, New Zealand, whatever like that, Sweden, around the world. So that loop, that's fact, that communism is as corporatist as the free West. It's quite clear, and it's sad for people in China that believed in something, that there was something in the West, that believed that there was something different in the West, to see that there is no alternative structure, because the West Trudeau believes that China is great and should be emulated. I've talked to communists who explained to me, and old communists as well, who explained to me how fantastic it is in China now. I've been there, and I love Chinese people, but we're not talking about Chinese people. We're talking about political structures. So this is what we're going to get, but it's going to be more invasive, because they'll be better at doing it, and the ability to resist will become less and less when the drones increase. And I mean, your own president has talked, in the context of gun control, about, well, how can people, with their weapons, resist the bombers, and because these things will be used against. See what happens in the absence of this, where the communists and the capitalists are in agreement. Well, then all this power is directed onto the citizens, on the creation of this security police, global planetary plantation. That's where it's going to. So by definition, it won't be easy to resist. It wasn't easy to resist the Roman Empire. They were resisting the British Empire for hundreds of years in Ireland. And talking about escape, I talked to my father's uncle who did escape from prison. They dug a tunnel out of it, and many of them escaped. So they were dealing with this process. But what happened was the British Empire changed. So it manifests or transmuted. It's like energy. It doesn't disappear. It just changes into one form. So it then focused on financial systems, international finance, the utilization of financial systems. Britain and other imperial powers did. The use of offshore, old colonial things, the Caribbean, Middle East centers to move money around, to make sure that you don't get any money for nothing, but they can move billions around the place. And that's associated with the military industrial complex, with the growth of shadow government and the growth of intelligence services that are independent of their own government, which US presidents warned us about. So there is a big challenge, but once you begin to see the whole thing is integrated, then the points of connection become, the vulnerabilities become a bit clearer, or the conceptual links, or the reason why we give acquiescence, we become a bit more aware of. We become a bit more aware of what the agenda behind the agenda is. And the more people do that, as they wake up and more network, they will question more. They're beginning to, you can see by comments and various things, they're becoming a bit more aware of narrative, how they've been manipulated. So this is the positive thing. And this is a grassroots, which is grown and has to grow very, very quickly, and not be astroturfing or dragged into things which are not real, which debates which are not real, which are falsified, divisive things to drag your attention into. When they focus on spiritual evolution and a robust analysis, so some of the, if you like, the people that are critical and that come up with daft analysis of the thing are not helping. There has to be a robust, coherent analysis which is worked out by evidence, which refers to evidence, which doesn't require a reference to strange forces, but can identify a specific apparatus and identify how it works and who works in it and how the operation is. It's only then that people will become creative in relation to non-violent solutions by conception and also persuasion. to persuade those people who have gone along for egotistical purposes or for status purposes to demonstrate that, well, ultimately it becomes nothing in many senses. And without the spiritual element, it's nothing. But we can only do so by convincing and by presenting an alternative path. Now, there's going to be loads of alternative paths. Many of them are not going to be sustainable. They're not going to work. They're not going to be tolerated. So there has to be a deeper engagement in those issues, a re-examination of some of the older ways and why they didn't work and how they're, well, as you said, they're not going to be tolerated. So my message is very, very positive. I don't want, but you can't ignore the reality, and this is what has got us into the problems that we're in. And also, we have to be all the issues, whether environmentalism, we have to look at what's true environmentalist good work and what's not, and the difference between, for example, avoiding pollution and the technocratic solution, which is really part of this apparatus as well.
Absolutely. And one thing I have encouraged my listeners in the past to do is to go on the World Economic Forum's website, right? And they have a list of all of their solutions that they would like to implement. And one example is like agriculture, for example. They talk about nourishing the world through GMOs, right? And it's very obvious when you start diving into each of their mission statements, how they have inverted the truth in that they are creating a lot of the problems that they're talking about with their quote unquote solutions. So, I mean, I think everybody has their own areas of expertise. They have their own areas where they know the truth. And, I can't go into the World Economic Forum's website and look at all of the I mean, they have about 15, 20 different areas that they cover in terms of different mission statements. I can't unpack all of those single-handedly
No.
necessarily, but I could find 15, 20 different people who could unpack each one of them, right? So, I mean, everybody has their own ability to really shed light on the truth in the way that they know how. And, I recently read a great piece on Substack from Charles Eisenstein, and he talked about how his quote that really stood out to me was along the lines of, when you choose to participate in these debates, whether it's gun control or abortion or the war in Russia and Ukraine, just by airing your opinion, uh, he says he doesn't really take stands on a lot of these issues because just by airing his opinion, he's consenting to the framework of the debate as it was presented.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
I think a lot of people lose uh, touch with that notion that by engaging in a lot of what the system is presenting, we are therefore and consenting to they don't, because the system doesn't mind the debate necessarily. They just want us to consent to the actual
Straight jacket.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. So
That's right. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think it's important for us to really be mindful of where we're putting our attention and energy, and to actually look at the reality as it is, but to make the emphasis in spiritual consciousness, like you said, and that will be able to really, I would say, place a proper frame on tackling a lot of these issues and uncovering the truth and finding a way to navigate the current times. Because I mean, there isn't one particular right way for somebody to combat this, but I think it comes from looking within, standing up straight. I mean, the most responsible thing we could do is sit up straight and tackle the world's challenges as they are and accept the responsibility that they're here, right? I mean, if we bury our heads in the sand, we might as well just be engaging in it and consenting to all of it. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's a good time to it's and something I asked Paul Check about, and I really liked his answer on. It's like I referenced the Bhagavad Gita in this. Is it's in a sense, when the fight comes to you and it's a proper fight, it's actually cowardice to lay down the sword, but that doesn't mean to fight in an imperialized way and fight with the same energy that was sprung onto you, but to really ground yourself into more of the, I would say, spiritual warrior archetype, which encapsulates the lover archetype within there. And like really rooted in the understanding of who we are. So
That's right. And I mean, their expertise is in arms and weapons.
yeah,
This was the basis. The idea of an engineer, and this is an engineering world that we're looking at, engine goes back to military engineers. Mass production was developed in places like the Venetian armory in the fourth, 15th century, and that's what they got good at, was making things in the systematic way that way before Taylorism and Fordism, etc., and the production line before the modern context of um, automation. But what I would say, I suppose, is that in order to understand this empire of scientism, I do that's the best way I have of explaining what the scientocracy is. This empire of scientism, which I believe we entered into on January the 1st, 2020. I think that was the phase that had been planned, and now we're moving deliberately into it. And you can see it in relation to, again, the ring of rules that's being made. So the next pandemic that they're planning for us, they will make sure they can bypass the nation state because of an international agreement. So this is in the pipeline, as well as all the other things. So they'll be able to control movement, make people stay at home, and they're pushing and pushing and pushing this again. And we have evolution in reverse, or devolution. So you're forcing the person to become not only on a plantation, but planted at home, to begin to restrict their movement. And fundamental part of all this is that you become denatured. You become separate from ecology. They don't want children to be out in the woods and all that. And that's part of the process, this health and safety thing, non-risk taking thing, and this fear that they inculcate. So the empire of scientism, it goes back, and that's why it's important for people to read a bit about history. All the words, culture, etc., goes back to the Romans. It goes back to the culture of land. It goes back to the control of land. Colony referred to establishing, and even they use that term, garden colonies. They still use that. Gardens, the use of, for example, the botanical gardens in Victorian era, or in the Dutch context, to spread knowledge, to assimilate knowledge, to as part of that apparatus, the use of plants, the use of crops, the control of crops, the control of goods, the use of pharmaceutical subjects, the control or the use of psychedelic substance. People criticize me for saying, "Oh, why doesn't he see the benefit of psychedelic substances and that?" And I've said I never have any problem with that. I'm not interested in myself, particularly at the moment. It's not. I've been more interested in stopping things, and that has been part of the process. That's a natural part of the spiritual evolution. So I don't criticize people. It's not, but it's not that. It's if you don't positively endorse psychedelics now, there's something wrong with you. And this is what and so I resist that. So, but people think, well, you have to positively endorse, or not, you're not spiritual in some sense. Although I resist the idea that prosthetics, and this is what, especially when you're talking about LSD, which is, it's not a naturally occurring thing. It comes from a lab in relation to, as opposed to traditional practices, which were known about and understood. The idea that we're going to get a mass soma to pacify people will be part of the continuation of the Good Friday experiments, and that's what I don't agree with Terence McKenna's focus on. So he was focused on novelty and prosthesis. So when he's writing about the information age, he sees it as a great liberating period, and he sees farmers or the mushrooms as part of this liberation thing, but still based on that idea of adding something to us, because we need this addition to it, a chemical addition to it, still a chemical addition to it, and that this experience is a substitute for. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't open up the doors of perception. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that personally, I don't. It's not something for me. I understand the studies are there and all that, and good luck to people, that it helps. And I'm certainly in favor of a liberal view towards that. But that doesn't mean that I have to take that approach. And I believe that every individual has the ability of the ability to go through this process, because it's ingrained in us. It's ingrained in our psyche. It's the direction of growth. So when the institutions are coming and saying, okay, we have confirmation, this thing, they're only reflecting what happens in the process. Even in the esoteric bodies or in Freemasonry, they may be talking about truth. They're talking about truth because they're not in the organization, they're in the person themselves, the elements that are there. So all of these bodies seek to reflect and structuralize what's there already. So what I'm saying is that we have access to all these possibilities, and we certainly don't have to buy into the illusion of provided by a quick fix solution presented by an industrial complex, which believes that will be able to induce passivity in people because of the perception of a fully lived spiritual life, because they have a sensational experience, which I'm not saying doesn't do them good, but the question is, over a period of time, does that help spiritual evolution? It will for some, but there's something else to it. It's deeper than that. It's not, we have to be individual and sovereign, but we don't become atomistic. It's relationships with other beings, with other consciousness, with nature, the higher consciousness. It's the positive loops that we form, that we initiate, that establish that increasing possibility of counteracting the kind of tendrils of electronic ivy that is trying to smother us and form a straitjacket around the planet with its shiny material objects.
Right. No, definitely. And it's interesting because even in something like the psychedelic experience, the actual experience is almost not that it's irrelevant to your growth and understanding, but it's the integration period after, where you're not on the psychedelics and you're actually back on earth, like back to your normal
Hmm.
waking consciousness. That's the more important part of it. And then you can
Yes,
continue to go, I was gonna
yeah,
say,
that makes sense.
you can continue to
And
go into it and you can use it again and again and again and again. But if you're not integrating and you're not actually taking a step back and trying to understand what it is, then it's a waste. Like you're kind of
yes, yeah, it's an experience. Yeah, that makes sense. But that's the point.
yeah.
I agree with that. That where it's utilized to open a door to move beyond, if and that may be needed in certain cases. That was what Huxley didn't have. He didn't have a disposition to go to a different level. He didn't have. It wasn't in his nature, and I'm not
Mm,
surprised being brought up in the background that he was. Thomas Huxley and all those people, Julian Huxley around him, they were very much invested in that kind of left brain idea. So it was difficult for him to engage in kind of spiritual experiences, and he missed it. And that's why he believed that for him, this was a way that he could have that experience that other people talked about.
right.
But again, one always has to be careful about whether one is getting a simulacrum of the real thing or not. And then the other question I always have is this, are you engaging with the natural unseen world or the supernatural? And that there's a difference between the going beyond, because again, quote Underhill, the mystics don't ever stay in that astral plane thing. They go beyond it. They don't dwell in that. That's not the zone that they're intended to go. So if one is committing oneself to a, from the constant descriptions, the question is, what commitment are you making to that world? And people say, well, but they assume that they don't have any responsibility. If they ontologically believe these creatures are real and they're communicating with them and they're signaling, and what deal have they made? And this is the Faustian Pact idea. What is one saying to that? Now, that's more relevant if you don't have any system. One of the ideas I think about possession, and that is that it's where there's an empty car space, that if you have created that force within you, that it's difficult to be as open to the parasitic or infection or possession. And that's why it's important, because that's what the protective thing. And actually, on an esoteric basis, one of the reasons why Christianity was so important, because Jesus had powers over these forces. And that's why even in the people that were conjuring spirits, they always had a reference back to Christian traditions and Judaic traditions. Very, very strange, for people that don't believe in any of this stuff, trying to engage the dark side. They use protection of, let's say, the Catholic tradition, and that the writers about Levi and all this Eliphas came from a Catholic background. It's no accident. So there was an antithesis between a positive, or seen to be a positive spiritual thing, and a negative thing, and even the negative people utilize the power of that. And that's why for a Catholic, or people like Malachi Martin, the classic Satanism is the deliberate inversion of that traditional thing. It's a deliberate thing, and associate then with abuse and all that kind of stuff. That's different from a kind of popular or a normal, or what's become a kind of entertainment or kind of lifestyle thing for what people see as in some sense as a contemporary Satanism. But the other stuff exists.
Right. Absolutely. And we can very easily look into the world and see where all of the inversions exist, see where we're looking for the instant gratification, the quick fixes. And I know quite a few people in the psychedelic community, for example, and I see um, people who, like, there's a lot of people who talk about it being a pathway to freedom, but then there's also people who go and they get their jabs and they conform to all of these different ideologies. And so they use it, like you described, as almost an artificial experience of the divine and what actually lives beyond the veil. And, I think the nature of transhumanism, if, to bring it back to transhumanism in general, like, you're creating the artificial experience of life and the inversion of life through a simulated technological um, realm where you get the half truths, you get the basic needs met, the very, very basic and a very shallow way, and you play into this much larger system without having the deeper connection to who you are, what exists in the unknown. And there isn't that need to explore, I would say, in a transhumanist mindset. Like, because I think the beauty of life is the exploration of the unknown and what you're going to find within that. And for me, when I see transhumanism, it's just it's the simulated version. It would be like trapping yourself in like some computer game or something along those lines, where you have a set. These are your set standards of what you could do, and this is how reality operates. Um, there's no escaping that box. So,
and that's what, in many ways, I think a lot of these theories that are often associated with transhumanists, we're living in a computer simulation. What they're telling you about is what the next step in the thing is, that you will actually be living in a computer simulated environment that's facilitated by the intervention in your screen of consciousness by technical means, whether through virtual reality, that you will actually be. It's not that it is, but they will make it become so. So that's the next consequence. And Terence McKenna, just to reiterate that point, he emphasized prosthesis in an information way and in the pharmaceutical way. So it's clear that idea of adding something in that's necessary. You don't have it. It says the implication is you don't have it. You're just an animal. I'm not saying about the just an animal, but it fits into an idea. You're limited. You need to be corrected. You need to be something done to you in order to become more than what you are. And of course, for the ultimate transhumanists, they're believing they're becoming gods. And Harari says, but of course the gods can do good and bad, be creative and destruction, because it's not God in the sense, it's these gods more in a Greek sense, that they have the power of gods, but not the responsibility. So they can play games with the public without any ethical basis, because there's nothing but their power and your submission and our submission. And they have said that, and Bernal said that in his book in the 20s, The World of Flesh and the Devil, that they could use the main goal was their curiosity, and the people in the human zoo could be experimented upon. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to be experimented on any more than has happened already. There's been enough going on, but you can imagine the things that they're going to do. I mean, I mean, seriously, there's some very, very strange examples if we look back at the history of science and what they've done, and they don't take any ownership for of the horrific things they've done repeatedly through experiments, not informing people, abusing people, utterly consistently. They're utterly consistent on that now. I'm not talking about all the people doing good work, but I mean the dark side, they take no responsibility. Why would they? They don't have any ethical basis. They don't believe that there's any force or any natural force that stops them doing it. It's just pure curiosity is the driving force. And there is another element which is important to emphasize, is that we've come to an idea that we shouldn't suffer. That is a fun, and a lot of transhumanism is based on the idea of avoidance of suffering, which actually ties in with Buddhism. And this is an aspect of Buddhism that can get overemphasized, that your goal is to avoid suffering. Now, the problem with that is that you begin to, at a certain stage, come close to some of these ideas. Oh, well, this is a way of avoiding suffering. We become a machine, for example, program, puppet. That's what, and it fits in. And there is a crossover between some of these things. But suffering is a feedback mechanism as well. It's a loop, and it should be a loop to grow from. Say you a simple example, continuing what we said, you eat all them sweets they give you, and then you get your toothache or whatever like that. I mean, it's the body is giving you a feedback loop. The pain is as we know, a protective system. So we've come to a situation where we believe all suffering should be masked or hidden or removed or reduced or be made numb to by taking pharmaceuticals. So the amount of people looking at the figures in the United States that are on some dampening kind of drug that makes them happy with the world. It's an early version of the somat thing, but what that necessitates or implies is an unwillingness to go through a suffering process. Now, in all the mystical traditions, there is kind of a suffering. There is the dark night of the soul, if you like. It's a particular phase in Underhill's 5-step characterization of the mystical evolution. It's the 4th stage, but it reflects a constant sense of loss, the sense of the abyss, the sense of futility, sense of not getting to something that one has. That's there. That's a natural part, often before the good period. So we can't avoid those. If when you go through the phase that you're meant to go through, that everyone is normally meant to go through, of disillusionment, disenchantment, that's a growth thing. Same as when you're a teenager and you're against everything your parents are against. And they were wrong. Only you knew what was the right thing. And if only they'd done something, there was always someone out there. If they just understood where you were, all those periods are natural growth periods. If we give up those growth periods, we can't grow in the same way. If we don't expose, if we don't accept that this is the nature of this reality that we're in, that things don't go our own way. And even sometimes when we want things to go our own way, if they came true in the way that we had imagined we believed them to be, they wouldn't be good. The famous curse of may our dreams come true, may our wishes come true. We don't often know what's good for us in some sense. And that's where the kind of humility of the spiritual thing comes into. Part of the over desire to control our spiritual evolution is more associated with magic, and it's more associated with that scientific way that you can control, because the whole point is, if you're engaging with a bigger consciousness, you may begin to get insights that seem to go against what you wanted to do. It doesn't seem to fit into what you think you want for your satisfaction. But the deeper thing says, no, that thing is not going to, that attachment is not going to work for you. And it pushes you in a direction that you initially you may not be intellectually disposed to going to. And there's no getting away from it. But existence has this, dark periods, things that, disillusionment, dissatisfaction, disenchantment, disappointment, failure to get things, irritation, anger, all those, they're part of the process. Transhumanism wants to take them out of the equation. They're bad. These things are bad, and they want to nullify that. And in certain traditions, as we said, like Buddhism is kind of founded on a resistance. That when the Buddha sees decay and all these things, he's resistant. Wants to resist those things about old age. I agree with a lot of the Buddhist core principles, but some of the things I do have difficulties with, because I do believe that is the inherent nature of our existence in that form in this particular planet. Now, for the next species, they can cut out all the pain and cut out all the suffering, but they'll also cut out all the creativity, and they'll cut out all the things where you get insight, and they'll cut out all the inherent compassion, that genuine altruism that comes from cooperation. They'll cut out that because they want to enforce it. They want to adopt the left brain model and make sure that it's managed, because it doesn't believe that these things are there in the right brain, they're there in the spirit, they're there in the deeper psyche. I think we should accept that. We should look back to the other examples, and that's why it's important to look back to the exemplars of all the people that achieved anything, all the people that went through, that attained some self-actualization. They went through difficult period. It's inherent in life. We should accept that that's going to happen. That's part of the roller coaster. That's part of the journey. That's part of the circuit that we're on. What we don't want to do is, when we're going through those periods, is solve it by going into a loop, a pharmaceutical loop, or by a loop of blaming someone else, or a loop of bitterness associate any people or any other people that we want to blame on, or that's where we go into a stagnant pool. We go into a marshland. We don't want to do that. We want to flow and grow in that sense. So and accept that things are not going to be always right. But if we do cultivate that sense of something in us, we will always persist. We will always save our spirit in that sense, and we will always, in that sense, persist. And as you said, that will carry into the next life, because a lot of the traditions are saying that how you are now is the way you will be in the next zone that we're moving through. And the last point on this, sometimes, and I accept all the near-death experience, I know how powerful they are. I remember years ago when I knew nothing about it, my mother explaining to me about her experience, and it changed her view of the afterworld, although she had been very religious in that. So I understand the power of that, but I wouldn't underestimate the elements in the near-death experience that emphasize that the loop is about understanding your loops with other people, and the relationships, and that kind of connection and the consciousness.
Absolutely. And when you eliminate suffering, or you attempt to eliminate suffering, like you said, you eliminate or dampen all aspects of life, really. I don't think you can eliminate suffering. And in the transhumanist model, where they attempt to eliminate suffering, they're just dampening it, and then they're unconsciously suffering in this perpetual state of misery. And there's no alleviation to it, because the true alleviation to the suffering is that creativity, it's that beauty, it's that embracing of all aspects of life, like you said. And I think that's, if anything, I think we can lean into the suffering and the chaos of these times, and see where that takes us ultimately. I don't think there's anything we need to fear or run away from, in a sense. Fear
No,
is,
and anything I say is not intended to cultivate or to contribute. That's the opposite. It's to try and concretize what the issues are. So the more people have a better analysis, and I know it does, from people I've talked to, it does help when they understand and I begin to join the dots and say, okay, I understand that connection. It's not about me. It's not about what they're saying to me. It's about this system. And we know that the seed needs to be in a dark place in order to grow. That's we have to embrace some of these elements of growth, and we have to. So I'm intended in any comments about that darkness is so that people can conceive it, and it's, as you said, the contrast is important. We know in art, when you make contrast, you begin to see the tensions, you begin to distinguish the things, you begin to see clearer with greater contrast. So when we have a very contrasted situation now, but we don't want to focus too much on the dark. We want to look at the things that are being revealed in the light and see the beauty of that. And beauty is a powerful force, and that's why the one of the reasons why they want to alienate us from nature is because we get power from nature. We get power from being with plants and animals, and from walking barefoot, and from swimming in the lake and swimming in the sea, and walking on mountains and sitting on rocks and playing and all these things. They give us power. So they don't want us to do these things. They don't want us to be getting power by playing and being playful and exploratory and being involved with nature and having respect for animals and dealing with animals and trying to commune with nature and trying to act differently in the environment. All that stuff gives us power, and they don't want us to do that because they want to have the total, and it is a totalitarian system, the totally automatic, totally authoritarian, automatic new world order, governance system, globe tech gov, that apparatus. That's what it is. I mean, I've studied this for years and from a legal sense, so it's not me finding some little conspiracy under a rock somewhere. I've looked at it, I've seen the process, and that's what it's going for. And it's certainly true that many people involved in it don't understand what the big game is. And game is an important thing, but we are being gamed, and there is a big game, and it's going to be a big computer game. And if you go along with it, you will live in a cartoon. That's what it will be, and it'll be as entertaining and as unpredictable as these and as violent as these cartoons are. So I'm certainly not afraid, and I'm not even afraid of catastrophe, cataclysm there. And even if I look back in the history of in the Irish context, they've experienced some horrific things. If you look at it, so, but whatever is to come, it won't change the initiated spirit or the aware spirit. It's not going to change that. Certain things are outside our control. It does respond, or we have the power to how we react to all those situations, however, even if they're terrible. But what I'm arguing is for that we take the positive thing, and it does require that we begin to move and change. And I'm annoyed. One thing that does annoy me is people that proclaim to be in a mystical dimension or aware of these things, and they get bogged down in mundane issues in the game that's played to them. They get into these loops, as you're saying. They get sucked, as Eisenstein said, they get sucked into these debates, and you see them getting on the merry-go-round. And they want to drag you in the merry-go-round. And if you're not on the merry-go-round, you're a bad person for not going around, the loop and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, that's annoying. And also the way we criticize other people. So you go and then you do your best with a kind of full heart to try and do things. And then we say, well, I don't like that guy because, I don't know, he has a beard, or he had a mustache once, or he didn't have a mustache. Well, you know what I mean? Some say, oh, that's true. Or he said something 20 years ago, or he said something in hundreds of hours of things that could mean this, and all this stuff. So we have to stop buying into that and supporting this notion and supporting these shunning techniques, excommunication techniques, all these nonsense things, and not buying into that, and defending people as well, and not allowing that Stalinist type of shaming, etc. When we really have to up our game. We really have to focus on what's important and support people that are endeavoring to do something to respond to that, to respond to the healing process, making whole of individuals, and to be able to encourage the genius of each individual to contribute in their own unique way at a higher level, in a higher level of consciousness, at a higher level of debate, a higher level of discourse, in a more informed, panoramic, wider context, with better polishing of people's arguments, perceptions, philosophy, working hard to find the links so that their view is coherent. And it does help, and it does provide a platform at a higher level to facilitate our evolution, to break through the ceiling that's been imposed on it.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. And, I guess whether we do that on a collective scale or not doesn't change the individual mission of
No,
each of
no,
us.
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
So,
So we might be the last man or woman in the world. We still have to engage in our own spiritual evolution. But if we can unleash the power of collective consciousness, not in an automatic way, but collective individuality, where we're employing the higher values, encouraging of compassion, imagination, looking at the environment again, looking at the way we live, not falling for all the guff that's given out, not repeating the guff they see on the television. I've been shocked at that. I'm constantly shocked when people start giving me these things that I know are talking points off the media without any, some of the issues I've been looking at for decades, and they begin to quote, and I shrivel a bit of some of the people that have surprised me. So I'm not painting myself, elevating myself in that way, but there's a time you have to say, okay, well, we have to up our game. All of us have to up our game to begin to be able to, so that we can survive in different forms, operate in different forms, but also indicate certain models and begin to influence as well the people that are players in the agenda, and to begin to open the possibility that, yes, some of these people in the system that are important will go through changes. They will be altered, and we have to. I see a job as well. I'm trained as or background as a barrister, but a barrister is an advocate. We need advocates of the spirit. That's what we have to do. We have to be advocates. And even there was a very interesting phrase by Swedenborg, the great founder of scientist and great founder of really a lot of spiritualism came from him. And he had an intriguing phrase in one of his books where he talked about secret agents of the Holy Spirit. And I thought that was a great expression, that everyone can act as secret agents of the Holy Spirit or the Great Spirit, because I think the Holy Spirit, as it used to exist in Christianity, was this very similar to the Great Spirit, and is very similar to the Shekinah, and it indicated a feminine power, a feminine divine power that involved the earth, and that in the Celtic Christianity recognized the significance of the earth and animals. It was there. It was there in the practices and in the traditions. So what we have to do is to reimagine and reunite some of these things. And we realize that we're not speaking about different things. We just have to get better grammar, better language, to let go of some of our attachments to the way forward, and to realize that a lot of them are not going to go forward. So there has to be a response which trumps, I used the word too specifically, but to trump the negative forces. But again, this is the power that consciousness, once it begins to emerge, will be impossible to defeat. That's why this period is going to be a period of great repression, because it can't tolerate any alternative vision, and that's why won't get so many views after mentioning the things we mentioned.
Well, I was gonna say, those who need to see it will see it, and maybe, I don't know, every once in a while things break through the algorithms. I think generally we do.
Yes, and I'm always surprised. You people that can be significant do watch, and it's the quality is important. So I'm not trying to to suggest,
Oh yeah.
suggest I'm very positive about your work. But we know how this
Yeah.
algorithmic bingo works. But that's even an important message, because a lot of people didn't realize that, they didn't understand that. It's only becoming aware of these things, and in fact, as I said before, it's a badge of respectability to not be promoted. And I noticed you talking about the sad guru
Oh yeah.
on this. I was interested. He was at the World Economic Forum, I think, this time. So that was an interesting revelation, if one needed a
Hmm.
revelation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've done some deep diving into Sadhguru, and I won't
No.
I don't know. He's good. It's interesting because it just goes to show you that there's people from all walks of life who are invested into, whether it be a mystic guru type or a politician, that are playing into the game of the world, like the World Economic Forum and these agendas, and we just need to continually use our discernment, because
Exactly. Yeah.
somebody like that, he has a lot of even grounded in mystical traditions, and then, well, still playing the game, right? It's still still
Yeah.
maybe part of the big club, and I don't know.
Yeah.
So just
So that's
discernment.
right. I mean, you're right. It is an argument in favor, and underlining the absolute significance that we do in our sovereignty. We develop our own intellectual sovereignty, and not be closed down to areas we don't know about, and to open up. And actually, if you're engaging in processes of spiritual evolution, as you said about the food issue, your capacity to be able to receive will increase. Your ability to be able to comprehend should be will increase as well. It doesn't mean that you have to read the complete works of William Shakespeare and the whole lot and all that in order to understand certain things. But it means that you will have a bit more clarity in relation to receiving the essential points. And people have so much opportunity now to enhance their ability and to begin to link things up. And I think that is happening. So it is a very empowering time for individuals, but they do have to get rid of that authority, even if it's, or especially if it's in a spiritual sense, where we bow down before the guru. And I understand it's important in traditions. It doesn't mean we don't get spiritual direction of people. That's a different issue.
Yeah.
Direction is very, very important, but we don't relinquish control over our spiritual development. The as you probably come across, the Celtic idea from the monastic tradition, which was repopularized by a guy called John O'Donoghue, was the notion of anam cara, which is a soul friend. And that's what people can do and give direction by a more equal idea, perhaps, but that another individual who has your best interest at heart can contribute towards your development, and vice versa, because there is some honest commitment. So, but we don't relinquish the no matter how persuasive the person is, and no matter how authentic they look. And there is certainly some interesting figures that are knocking around. If you look at what they say, it may and look at particular details, it may not actually be what you think their disposition is.
Exactly. Well, and that plays into those half truths, like we're saying. You sell it. I mean, one could look at the mission of the World Economic Forum and say, "Wow, what a noble organization! Look at them trying to save humanity." But when you get into the root of it, it's like, oh, okay, now I actually
The
see
only thing
their
you can't find in there is any economics.
right. Yeah, exactly.
There's,
Where's any no economic policy, no nothing.
yeah.
It's a even the
But I
name
mean, the
is
good thing,
inverted.
even now, if I had said a couple of years ago talking about World Economic Forum, people wouldn't be interested and no idea what you're talking about. It
Yeah.
is remarkable that rapidly some of these issues have come on the agenda, because I mean, they're on the agenda, and the loop is becoming a bit more exposed. And part of that is exposure is because it feels confident. The reason why Yuval Noah Harari is saying these things is because he feels empowered, because they believe that they have it in the bag, and also they believe that this recent crisis that we won't mention has achieved a great movement forward in that process, which no doubt that it has done. So, but the awareness of these issues is growing, and that's a good thing. And it's taken a while, but they will change as well, because they're already all from moving in the places that they're meeting, and more in strange places meetings, and of course there'll be all these networks that they are meeting on. So some of those old systems won't persist in the same way, but the infrastructure will be there. But it's the principles and the signs and the signals that we have to pay attention to.
Exactly. Trust our own intuition and discernment, and go from there. So,
and
I was gonna say,
inform our awareness of that system, so that we begin to recognize it, and we begin to know when people are operatives in that system, and begin to have a dialogue, or begin to open awareness, or begin to hold up a mirror to what's happening, and begin to question, and begin to be courageous about marshalling arguments about. And there is, I know from context with people that I have, that people that have experienced the bitterness of administrative overreach in recent context have learned a lesson, and realized that you can't run away from this thing, and that it is better to then begin to face it. And as well, I mean, in fairness to the judges and certain of the decisions in the United States about mandates, or about the 100 employees issue in the Supreme Court, we must have respect for that. There are a lot of decent judges out there that we shouldn't forget about. A lot of hard-working people that, if the facts and evidence is presented properly, will make the right decisions. So we can't get too disillusioned with that. And in fact, the court system in the United States is a reservoir of possibilities to counteract some of these things. So we can't get too disillusioned. We have to have faith in people in the apparatus before they're all changed, and before it's made more automatic, and to have respect for those people that entered those careers with highest integrity and highest commitment to civil service and to their fellow citizens and the Constitution. So, but the problem, of course, is that realpolitik and has undermined a lot of, say, the Constitution of the United States, in order to reconstitute on a global governance model, as is clear for most of your high-ranking politicians over there. The commitment is to something beyond their constituency.
Right. And it's quite clear once you start looking at what they're flaying for, much larger than just national sovereignty per se. So James, we're at about 3.5 hours. I mean, we hit on a lot of subjects, and I feel like we can just keep exploring. So, I mean, I guess we'll plan on doing another podcast. How long do you think until your next book is complete? I know you said you're getting close to finishing one right now. What's your own research?
It'll be out this summer, yeah. And
wonderful.
I want to. There's a couple of ideas. The other element of I didn't really go into, but the automation aspect is critical, and to try and explain that, and also to show how operationally this has been implemented, and how they go together, looking at as well a whole range of different diverse contexts, from synth pop to plantations to botany, whatever like that, and to try and synthesize around the simple ideas. But again, so in relation to what we've talked about tonight, I would, to summarize, that we have to focus on our autonomy as spiritual beings, and our physical autonomy in relation to how we interact with the world. That the problem is the tendency towards psychological automaticity, which can be reinforced and will be by a controlling mechanism of automatic processes outside of us, which seeks to press on us, which is part of a control system, which is part of a new global system, which will be automatic institutions, automatic control, machines, computers, artificial intelligence, which controls down to what you eat and what you do, and then ultimately controls your consciousness. So the beauty of automaticity, we have to be very careful about. I'm not saying that this automation can't help us in many ways, but there has to be a balance, and the balance has to be with rigorous awareness of consequence, and in particular, when we have the convergence of automatic systems, both regulatory and machine, in our consciousness, well, we have a big problem. So we have to resist some of this convergence, some of our acquiescence, giving into these systems. So it's a useful one. And again, the loop, if we begin to think in terms of loops at various levels, and the utilization of those communication loops coming to a big loop, which we're being sucked into, and understand our processes, relationships, what it should be as a spiritual creation of spiritual loops with divine consciousness in a transcendent vertical and horizontal way, we'll begin to, and in a natural way with nature, we'll begin to understand what it is. And we understand our own feedback loops, how it operates for us. You'll notice as well, the last point, they're going to come in with an idea of the circular economy. This is the loop again, which seems good, but unfortunately, as capitalism is collapsing, we're going to encounter some of these things, because a lot of that train is leaving the station very, very quickly. Yeah, but the hopeful point is we have to learn from the spiritual tradition and begin to form our own connections, and begin to, most importantly, become aware of our spiritual identity.
Absolutely. And I will say your work has definitely helped me become aware of my own automaticity type of patterns or loops that exist as I sort of continue to dive into this realm deeper and deeper. And the rabbit hole goes on in infinite, it
Yeah, good
seems.
luck. And I'm glad to see you writing on those topics, and it's great. And your knowledge and awareness and insight will just grow and grow, and that's fantastic. And it's nice to hear a range of voices with their unique perspectives coming in, and that's where we get momentum from. So I wish you well with your explorations on that, and learning as well from your explorations.
Oh, I appreciate it. Well, I think I mentioned in an email. It's funny. Somebody invited me on their podcast, and I'm going on next week to talk about transhumanism. And I'm like, well, the
Great.
dominoes
Yeah.
are going, like, people want to know about this. So, and
Yeah.
I've noticed that if I post something about the transhumanist movement, that actually gets a lot more engagement than a lot of other subjects. Like in terms of, so I think people are very intrigued and
There
interested.
is an amazing process as well, and it's clear in the mystical tradition that, and it's what Joseph Campbell talked about in the hero's journey, the journey, that once you commit yourself to the path, then things move to assist you on that journey. It doesn't mean that it's not difficult, but there is an odd phenomenon about that, and that there is a certain degree and some level of an effortlessness in the big effort, but there's at the central of the most meaningful aspect becomes effortless in that sense, like water, because there's only one direction the water can flow in that sense. It has to go to the base. Yeah, I hope those things can grow in relation to that, but it's very, very important. And also that's part of our own individual evolution to contribute to that, when we gain insight, to begin to shape and to learn, and to begin to find nuances that we can particularly present, or particular elements. So good luck with that. Yeah.
Oh, I appreciate it. And, just connecting dots and seeing where we go. And, I'm
Yeah.
sure the next time we chat, we'll both have far more insight into these subjects than we had today, and that's how the journey goes, right? And we'll just
Yes, yeah, yeah. And we can continue perhaps with the other element that I emphasized in the book to explain organizational context. But yeah, I look forward to that conversation.
all right, I do too. And thank you to all the listeners for tuning on in to the episode. For those who have made it 3.5 hours, kudos to you, ran a marathon with us, and we'll see you all on the next show.